Memories of Midnight. Sydney Sheldon. Greece, 1948. In the seclusion of a remote convent, a young woman emerges from the trauma of memory loss. To Catherine Alexander, Larry's widow, Demirous seems a benefactor, the man who helps her build a life again. She knows that Larry and Noelle are dead, but not who was responsible. Nor that Demirous' desire for revenge is unquenched, that there is a last, unsilenced victim. In this atmosphere of deception, Catherine's move to London seems just another example of Demirous' good nature. Set down in a strange and unsettling environment, she cannot guess the fate her benefactor has in store, or that her life is inextricably bound up with other victims of his mighty ego. Moving from the exotic shores of the Mediterranean to post-war London, Memories of Midnight is the compelling portrayal of one woman's fight against a terrifying destiny. Sidney Sheldon's genius as a master storyteller has never been more powerfully displayed. Kowloon, May 1949. It must look like an accident. Can you arrange that? It was an insult. He could feel the anger rising in him. That was a question you asked some amateur you picked up from the streets. He was tempted to reply with sarcasm. Oh, yes, I think I can manage that. Would you prefer an accident indoors? I can arrange for her to break her neck falling down a flight of stairs. The dancer in Marseille. Or she could get drunk and drown in her bath. The heiress in Gstaad. She could take an overdose of heroin. He had disposed of 3 that way. Or, she could fall asleep in bed with a lighted cigarette. The Swedish detective at L+ telephone on the left bank in Paris. Or perhaps you would prefer something outdoors. I can arrange a traffic accident, a plane crash, or a disappearance at sea, but he said none of those things, for in truth he was afraid of the man seated across from him. He had heard too many chilling stories about him, and he had reason to believe them, so all he said was, "Yes, sir, I can arrange an accident. No one will ever know." Even as he said the words, the thought struck him, he knows that I'll know. He waited. They were on the 2nd floor of a building in the walled city of Kowloon that had been built in 1840 by a group of Chinese to protect themselves from the British barbarians. The walls had been torn down in the Second World War, but there were other walls that kept outsiders away. Gangs of cutthroats and drug addicts and rapists roaming through the rabbit warren of crooked, narrow streets and dark stairways leading into gloom. Tourists were warned to stay away, and not even the police would venture inside past Tung Tao Chun Street, on the outskirts. He could hear the street noises outside the window, and the shrill and raucous polyglot of languages that belonged to the residents of the walled city. The man was studying him with cold, obsidian eyes. Finally he spoke. "Very well. I will leave the method to you." "Yes, sir. Is the target here in Kowloon?" "London. Her name is Catherine Alexander." A limousine, followed by a second car with 2 armed bodyguards, drove the man to the Blue House on Lasker Row, in the Sim Sha Sui area. The Blue House was open to special patrons only. Heads of state visited there, and movie stars, and presidents of corporations. The management prided itself on discretion. Half a dozen years earlier, one of the young girls who worked there had discussed her customers with a newspaperman, and she was found the next morning in Aberdeen Harbour with her tongue cut out. Everything was for sale in the Blue House: virgins, boys, lesbians who satisfied themselves without the jade stocks of men, and animals. It was the only place he knew of where the 10th century art of Ishinpo was still practiced. The Blue House was a cornucopia of forbidden pleasures. The man had ordered the twins this time. They were an exquisitely matched pair with beautiful features, incredible bodies, and no inhibitions. He remembered the last time he had been there. The metal stool with no bottom and their soft caressing tongues and fingers, and the tub filled with fragrant warm water that overflowed onto the tiled floor, and their hot mouths plundering his body. He felt the beginning of an erection. "We're here, sir." 3 hours later, when he had finished with them, sated and content, the man ordered the limousine to head for Modi Road. He looked out the window of the limousine at the sparkling lights of the city that never slept. The Chinese had named it Kowloon 9 Dragons, and he imagined them lurking in the mountains above the city, ready to come down and destroy the weak and the unwary. He was neither. They reached Modi Road. The Taoist priest waiting for him looked like a figure from an ancient parchment, with a classic faded oriental robe and a long, wispy white beard. "Ju San. Ju Satin. Gay Du Chin. El Yachin. Bao." The priest closed his eyes in a silent prayer and began shaking the chim, the wooden cup filled with numbered prayer sticks. A stick fell out and the shaking ceased. In the silence, the Taoist priest consulted his chart and turned to his visitor. He spoke in halting English. "The gods say you will soon be rid of dangerous enemy." The man felt a pleasant jolt of surprise. He was too intelligent not to realize that the ancient art of Qim was merely a superstition, and he was too intelligent to ignore it. Besides, there was another good luck omen. Today was Agios Constantino's day, his birthday. "The gods have blessed you with good shui. Du Jie, Hua." 5 minutes later, he was in the limousine, on his way to Kai Tak, the Hong Kong airport, where his private plane was waiting to take him back to Athens. Chapter 1 plus Ioannina, Greece, July 1948. She woke up screaming every night, and it was always the same dream. She was in the middle of a lake in a fierce storm, and a man and a woman were forcing her head under the icy waters, drowning her. She awakened each time, panicky, gasping for breath, soaked with perspiration. She had no idea who she was, and she had no memory of the past. She spoke English, but she did not know what country she was from or how she had come to be in Greece. In the small Carmelite convent that sheltered her as time went by, there were tantalizing flashes of memory, glimpses of vague, ephemeral images that came and went too quickly for her to grasp them, to hold them and examine them. They came at unexpected moments, catching her off guard, and filling her with confusion. In the beginning, she had asked questions. The Carmelite nuns were kind and understanding, but theirs was an order of silence, and the only one permitted to speak was Sister Teresa, the elderly and frail Mother Superior. "Do you know who I am?" "No, my child," Sister Teresa said. "How did I get to this place?" "At the foot of these mountains is a village called Ioannina. You were in a small boat in the lake during a storm last year. The boat sank, but by the grace of God, 2 of our sisters saw you and rescued you. They brought you here. But where did I come from before that?" "I'm sorry, child. I do not know." She could not be satisfied with that. "Hasn't anyone inquired about me? Hasn't anyone tried to find me?" Sister Teresa shook her head. "No one." She wanted to scream with frustration. She tried again. "The newspapers. They must have had a story about my being missing. As you know, we are permitted no communication with the outside world. We must accept God's will, child. We must thank Him for all His mercies. You are alive." And that was as far as she was able to get. In the beginning, she had been too ill to be concerned about herself, but slowly, as the months went by, she had regained her strength and her health. When she was strong enough to move about, she spent her days tending the colorful gardens in the grounds of the convent, in the incandescent light that bathed Greece in a celestial glow, with the soft winds carrying the pungent aroma of lemons and vines. The atmosphere was serene and calm, and yet she could find no peace. "I'm lost," she thought, "and no one cares. Why? Have I done something evil? Who am I? Who am I? Who am?" The images continued to come, unbidden. One morning she awakened suddenly with a vision of herself in a room with a naked man undressing her. Was it a dream? Or was it something that had happened in her past? Who was the man? Was it someone she had married? Did she have a husband? She wore no wedding ring. In fact, she had no possessions other than the black order of the Carmelite habit that Sister Teresa had given her, and a pin, a small golden bird with ruby eyes and outstretched wings. She was anonymous, a stranger living among strangers. There was no one to help her, no psychiatrist to tell her that her mind had been so traumatized it could stay sane only by shutting out the terrible past. And the images kept coming, faster and faster. It was as though her mind had suddenly turned into a giant jigsaw puzzle, with odd pieces tumbling into place. But the pieces made no sense. She had a vision of a huge studio filled with men in army uniform. They seemed to be making a motion picture. Was I an actress? No, she seemed to be in charge. But in charge of what? A soldier handed her a bouquet of flowers. "You'll have to pay for these yourself," they laughed. 2 nights later, she had a dream about the same man. She was saying goodbye to him at the airport, and she woke up sobbing because she was losing him. There was no more peace for her after that. These were not mere dreams. They were pieces of her life, her past. Must find out who I was. Who I am. And unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, without warning, a name was dredged up out of her subconscious. Catherine. My name is Catherine Alexander. Chapter 2 meters ++. Athens, Greece. The empire of Constantine Demyrus could not be located on any map, yet he was the ruler of a fiefdom larger and more powerful than many countries. He was one of the 2 or 3 wealthiest men in the world and his influence was incalculable. He had no title or official position, but he regularly bought and sold prime ministers, cardinals, ambassadors and kings. Demirous tentacles were everywhere, woven through the woof and warp of dozens of countries. He was a charismatic man, with a brilliantly incisive mind, physically striking, well above medium height, with a barrel chest and broad shoulders. His complexion was swarthy and he had a strong Greek nose and olive black eyes. He had the face of a hawk, a predator. When he chose to take the trouble, Demirous could be extremely charming. He spoke 8 languages and was a noted raconteur. He had one of the most important art collections in the world, a fleet of private planes and a dozen apartments, chateaux and villas scattered around the globe. He was a connoisseur of beauty, and he found beautiful women irresistible. He had the reputation of being a powerful lover, and his romantic escapades were as colorful as his financial adventures. Constantine Demirous prided himself on being a patriot. The blue and white Greek flag was always on display at his villa in Kolonaki and on Sara, his private island, but he paid no taxes. He did not feel obliged to conform to the rules that applied to ordinary men. In his veins ran ichor, the blood of the gods. Nearly every person Demirous met wanted something from him: financing for a business project, a donation to a charity, or simply the power that his friendship could bestow. Demirous enjoyed the challenge of figuring out what it was that people were really after, for it was rarely what it appeared to be. His analytical -1/2 mind was skeptical of surface truth, and as a consequence he believed nothing he was told and trusted no one. His motto was keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. The reporters who chronicled his life were permitted to see only his geniality, greater than in charm, the sophisticated, urbane man of the world. They had no reason to suspect that beneath the amiable Faggot, Demirous was a killer, a gutter fighter whose instinct was to go for plus the jugular vein. He was an unforgiving man who never forgot a slight. To the ancient Greeks the word dikaiosini, justice, was often synonymous with ekdikasis, vengeance, and Demirous was obsessed with both. He remembered every affront he had ever suffered, and those who were unlucky enough to incur his enmity were paid back 100-fold. They were never aware of it, for Demirous' mathematical mind made a game of exacting retribution, patiently working out elaborate traps and spinning complex webs that finally caught and destroyed his enemies. He enjoyed the hours he spent devising pitfalls for his adversaries. He would study his victims carefully, analyzing their personalities, assessing their strengths and their weaknesses. At a dinner party one evening, Demirous had overheard a motion picture producer refer to him as that oily Greek. Demirous bided his time. 2 years later, the producer signed a glamorous internationally known actress to star in his new big-budget production in which he put in his own money. Demirous waited until the picture was half finished and then charmed the leading lady into walking out on it and joining him on his yacht. "It will be a honeymoon," Demirous told her. She got the honeymoon but not the wedding. The movie finally had to shut down and the producer went bankrupt. There were a few players in Demirous' game with whom he had not yet evened the score, but he was in no hurry. He enjoyed the anticipation, the planning and the execution. These days he made no enemies, for no man could afford to be his enemy, so his quarry was limited to those who had crossed his path in the past. But Constantine Demirous' sense of dikaiosini was double-edged. Just as he never forgave an injury, neither did he forget a favor a poor fisherman who had given the young boy shelter found himself the owner of a fishing fleet. A prostitute who had fed and clothed the young man when he was too poor to pay her, mysteriously inherited an apartment building, without any idea of who her benefactor was. Demirous had started life as the son of a stevedore in Piraeus. He had 14 brothers and sisters and there was never enough food on the table from the very beginning. Constantine Demirous showed an uncanny gift for business. He earned extra money doing odd jobs after school, and at 16, he had saved enough money to open a food stand on the docks with an older partner. The business flourished and the partner cheated Demirous out of his half. It took Demirous 10 years to destroy the man. The young boy was burning with a fierce ambition. He would lie awake at night, his eyes bright in the darkness. "I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be famous. Someday everyone will know my name." It was the only lullaby that could put him to sleep. He had no idea how it was going to happen. He knew only that it would. On Demirous' 17th birthday, he came across an article about the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, and it was as though a magic door to the future had suddenly opened for him. He went to his father. I'm going to Saudi Arabia. I'm going to work in the oil fields. 2 Sue. What do you know about oil fields? Nothing, father. I'm going to learn. 1 month later, Konstantin Demiris was on his way. It was company policy for the overseas employees of the Transcontinental Oil Corporation to sign a 2-year employment contract, but Demiris felt no qualms about it. He planned to stay in Saudi Arabia for as long as it took him to make his fortune. He had envisioned a wonderful Arabian Nights adventure, a glamorous, mysterious land with exotic-looking women, and black gold gushing up out of the ground. The reality was a shock. On an early morning in summer, Demiris arrived at Fadili, a dreary camp in the middle of the desert, consisting of an ugly stone building surrounded by baristas, small brushwood huts. There were 1,000 lower bracket workers there, mostly Saudis. The women who trudged through the dusty, unpaved streets were heavily veiled. Demiris entered the building where asked Multair, the personnel manager, had his office. Multair looked up as the young man came in. So, the Home Office hired you, eh? Yes, sir. Ever worked the oil fields before, son? For an instant, Demiris was tempted to lie. No, sir. Multair grinned. You're going to love it here. You're a million miles from nowhere, bad food, no women that you can touch without getting your balls chopped off, and not a goddamn thing to do at night. But the pay is good, right? I'm here to learn, Demiris said earnestly. Yeah. Then I'll tell you what, you better learn fast. You're in Muslim country now. That means no alcohol. Anyone caught stealing gets his right hand cut off. Second time, left hand. The third time, you lose a foot. If you kill anyone, you're beheaded. I'm not planning to kill anyone. Wait, Multair grunted. You just got here. The compound was a Tower of Babel, people from a dozen different countries all speaking their native languages. Demiris had a good ear and picked up languages quickly. The men were there to make roads in the middle of an inhospitable desert, construct housing, install electrical equipment, put in telephone communications, build workshops, arrange food and water supplies, design a drainage system, administer medical attention and, it seemed to young Demiris, to do 100 other tasks. They were working in temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, suffering from flies, mosquitoes, dust, fever and dysentery. Even in the desert there was a social hierarchy. At the top were the men engaged in locating oil, and below, the construction workers called stiffs, and the clerks known as shiny pants. Nearly all the men involved in the actual drilling, the geologists, surveyors, engineers and oil chemists, were Americans, for the new rotary drill had been invented in the United States and the Americans were more familiar with its operation. The young man went out of his way to make friends with them. Konstantin Demiris spent as much time as he could around the drillers and he never stopped asking questions. He stored away the information, absorbing it the way the hot sands soaked up water. He noticed that 2 different methods of drilling were being used. He approached one of the drillers working near a giant 130-foot derrick. I was wondering why there are 2 different kinds of drilling going on. The driller explained. Well, son, one's cable tool and one's rotary. We're going more to rotary now. They start out exactly the same. They do. Yeah. For either one you have to erect a derrick like this one to hoist up the pieces of equipment that have to be lowered into the well. He looked at the eager face of the young man. Till bet you have no idea why they call it a derrick. No, sir. That was the name of a famous hangman in the 17th century. I see. Cable tool drilling goes way back. Hundreds of years ago, the Chinese used to dig water wells that way. They punched a hole into the earth by lifting and dropping a heavy cutting tool hung from a cable. But today about 85% of all wells are drilled by the rotary method. He turned to go back to his drilling. Excuse me. How does the rotary method work? The man stopped. Well, instead of slamming a hole in the earth, you just bore one. You see here. In the middle of the derrick floor is a steel turntable that's rotated by machinery. This rotary table grips and turns a pipe that extends downward through it. There's a bit fastened to the lower end of the pipe. It seems simple, doesn't it? It's more complicated than it looks. You have to have a way to excavate the loosened material as you drill. You have to prevent the walls from caving in and you have to seal off the water and gas from the well. With all that drilling, doesn't the rotary drill ever get dull? Sure. Then we have to pull out the whole damn drill string, screw a new bit to the bottom of the drill pipe and lower the pipe back into the hole. Are you planning to be a driller? No, sir. I'm planning to own oil wells. Congratulations. Can I get back to work now? One morning, Demirous watched as a tool was lowered into the well, but instead of boring downward, he noticed that it cut small circular areas from the sides of the hole and brought up rocks. Excuse me. What's the point of doing that? Demirous asked. The driller paused to mop his brow. This is sidewall coring. We use these rocks for analysis, to see whether they're oil-bearing. I see. When things were going smoothly, Demirous would hear drillers cry out, "I'm turning to the right," which meant they were making a hole. Demirous noticed that there were dozens of tiny holes drilled all over the field, with diameters as small as 2 or 3 inches. Excuse me. What are those for? The young man asked. Those are prospect wells. They tell us what's underneath. Saves the company a lot of time and money. I see. It was all utterly fascinating to the young man and his questions were endless. Excuse me. How do you know where to drill? We got a lot of geologists, pebble pups, who take measurements of the strata and study the cuttings from wells. Then the rope chokers. Single quote. Excuse me, what's a rope choker? A driller. When they Constantine Demirous worked from early morning until sundown, hauling rigs through the burning desert, cleaning equipment, and driving trucks past the streamers of flame rising from the rocky peaks. The flames burned day and night, carrying off the poisonous gases. Asked. Multair had told Demirous the truth. The food was bad, living conditions were horrible, and at night there was nothing to do. Worse, Demirous felt as though every pore in his body were filled with grains of sand. The desert was alive and there was no way to escape it. The sand filtered into the hut and through his clothes and into his body until he thought he would go crazy, and then it got worse. The shamal struck. The sandstorms blew every day for a month, driven by a howling wind with an intensity strong enough to drive men mad. Demirous stared out the door of his baristee at the swirling sand. Are we going out to work in that? You're fucking right, Charlie. This ain't a health spa. Oil discoveries were being made all around them. There was a new find at Abu Hadraya and another at Qatif and at Harad, and the workers were kept busier than ever. There were 2 new arrivals. An English geologist and his wife. Henry Potter was in his late 60s and his wife, Sybil, was in her early 30s. In any other setting, Sybil Potter would have been described as a plain-looking, obese woman with a high, unpleasant voice. In Fadili, she was a raving beauty. Since Henry Potter was constantly away prospecting for new oil fields, his wife was left alone a great deal. Young Demirous was assigned to help her move into their quarters and to assist her in getting settled. This is the most miserable place I've ever seen in my life, Sybil Potter complained in her whining voice. Henry's always dragging me off to terrible places like this. I don't know why I put up with it. Your husband is doing a very important job, Demirous assured her. She eyed the attractive young man speculatively. My husband isn't doing all the jobs he should be doing. Do you know what I mean? Demirous knew exactly what she meant. No, ma'am. What's your name? Demirous, ma'am. Constantine Demirous. What do your friends call you? Costa. Well, Costa, I think you and I are going to become very good friends. We certainly have nothing in common with these wogs, have we? Wogs. You know, these foreign people. I have to go back to work, Demirous said. Over the next few weeks, Sybil Potter constantly found excuses to send for the young man. Henry left again this morning, she told him. He's off to do his silly drilling. She added archly, he should do more drilling at home. Demirous had no answer. The geologist was a very important man in the company hierarchy, and Demirous had no intention of getting involved with Potter's wife, and jeopardizing his own job. He was not sure exactly how, but he knew without question that one way or another this job was going to be his passport to everything he dreamed of. Oil was the future and he was determined to be a part of it. One midnight, Sybil Potter sent for Demirous. He walked into the compound where she lived, and knocked at the door. Come in. Sybil was wearing a thin nightgown that unfortunately concealed nothing. Did you want to see me, ma'am? Yes, come in, Costa. This bedside lamp doesn't seem to be working. Demirous averted his eyes and walked over to the lamp. He picked it up to examine it. There's no bulb in. Single quote. And he felt her body pressing against his back and her hands groping him. Mrs. Potter, her lips were on his and she was pushing him onto the bed. And he had no control over what happened next. His clothes were off and he was plunging into her and she was screaming with joy. That's it. Oh, Yes, that's it. My God, it's been so long. She gave a final gasp and shuddered. Oh, darling, I love you. Demirous lay there panicky. What have I done? If Potter ever finds out I'm finished, as though reading his mind, Sybil Potter giggled. This will be our little secret, won't it, darling? Their little secret went on for the next several months. There was no way Demirous could avoid her, and, since her husband was away for days at a time on his explorations, Demirous could think of no excuse to keep from going to bed with her. What made it worse was that Sybil Potter had fallen madly in love with him. You're much too good to be working in a place like this, darling, she told him. You and I are going back to England. My home is Greece. Not anymore. She stroked his long, lean body. You're going to come back home with me. I'll divorce Henry and we'll get married. Demirous felt a sudden sense of panic. Sybil, I have no money. She ran her tips down his chest. That's no problem. I know how you can make some money, sweetheart. You do. She sat up in bed. Last night, Henry told me he's just discovered some big new oil field. He's very clever at that, you know. Anyway, he seemed terribly excited about it. He wrote out his report before he left and he asked me to send it out in the morning pouch. I have it here. Would you like to see it? Demirous' heart began to beat faster. Yes, I would. He watched her get out of bed and lumber over to a small battered table in the corner. She picked up a large manila envelope and returned to the bed with it. Open it. Demirous hesitated for only an instant. He opened the envelope and took out the papers inside. There were 5 pages. He scanned through them quickly, then went back to the beginning and read every word. Is that information worth anything? Is that information worth anything? It was a report on a new field that could possibly turn out to be one of the richest oil fields in history. Demirous swallowed. Yes, it could be. Well, there you are, Sybil said happily. Now we have money. He sighed. It's not that simple. Why not? Demirous explained. This is valuable to someone who can afford to buy up options on the land around this area. But that takes money. He had $300 in his bank account. Oh, don't worry about that. Henry has money. I'll write a check. Will $5,000 be enough? Constantine Demirous could not believe what he was hearing. Yes. I don't know what to say. It's for us, darling. For our future. He sat up in bed thinking hard. Sybil, do you think you could hold on to that report for the next day or two? Of course. I'll keep it till Friday. Will that give you enough time, darling? He nodded slowly. That will give me enough time. 1. With the $5,000 that Sybil gave him, no, it's not a gift, it's a loan, he told himself. Constantine Demirous bought up options on acres of land around the new potential strike some months later. When the gushers began to come in the main field, Constantine Demirous was an instant millionaire. He repaid Sybil Potter the $5,000, sent her a new nightgown, and returned to Greece. She never saw him again. Chapter 3. There is a theory that nothing in nature is ever lost, that every sound ever made, every word ever spoken, still exists somewhere in space and time, and may one day be recalled. Before radio was invented, they say, who would have believed that the air around us was filled with the sounds of music and news and voices from around the world? One day we will be able to travel back in time and listen to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the voice of Shakespeare, the Sermon on the Mount. Catherine Alexander heard voices from her past, but they were muffled and fragmented, and they filled her with confusion. Do you know you're a very special girl, Kathy? I felt it from the first time I saw you. It's over, I want a divorce. I'm in love with someone else. Single quote. I know how badly I've behaved. I'd like to make it up to you. Single quote. He tried to kill me. Who tried to kill you? My husband. The voices would not stop. They were a torment. Her past became a kaleidoscope of shifting images that kept racing through her mind. The convent should have been a wonderful, peaceful haven, but it had suddenly become a prison. I don't belong here. But where do I belong? She had no idea there were no mirrors in the convent, but there was a reflecting pool outside, near the garden. Catherine had carefully avoided it, afraid of what it might reveal to her. But on this morning, she walked over to it, slowly knelt, and looked down. The pool reflected a lovely-looking, suntanned woman with black hair, flawless features and solemn, gray eyes that seemed filled with pain. But perhaps that was merely a trick of the water. She saw a generous mouth that looked ready to smile, and a nose that was slightly turned up, a beautiful woman in her early 30s. But a woman with no past and no future. A woman lost. Needs someone to help me, Catherine thought desperately, someone I can talk to. She went into Sister Teresa's office. Sister, yes, child. I think I would like to see a doctor. Someone who can help me find out who I am. Sister Teresa looked at her a long moment. Sit down. Catherine sat on the hard chair across from the ancient, scarred desk. Sister Teresa said quietly, my dear, God is your doctor. In due time he will let you know what he wishes you to know. Besides, no outsiders are ever permitted within these walls. Catherine had a sudden flash of memory. A vague image of a man talking to her in the garden of the convent, handing her something. But then it was gone. I don't belong here. Where do you belong? And that was the problem. I'm not sure. I'm searching for something. Forgive me, Sister Teresa, but I know it isn't here. Sister Teresa was studying her, her face thoughtful. I see. If you left here, where would you go? I don't know. Let me think about this, child. We will talk again soon. Thank you, sister. When Catherine left, Sister Teresa sat at her desk for a long time, staring at nothing. It was a difficult decision that she had to make. Finally she reached for a piece of paper and a pen, and began to write. Dear sir, she began. Something has happened that I feel I should call to your attention. Our mutual friend has informed me that she wishes to leave the convent. Please advise me what to do. He read the note once, and then sat back in his chair, analyzing the consequences of the message. So, Catherine Alexander wants to come back from the dead. Too bad. I'll have to get rid of her carefully. Very carefully. The first step was to remove her from the convent. Demiurus decided it was time to pay Sister Teresa a visit. The following morning, Demiurus had his chauffeur take him to Ioannina. Driving through the countryside, Constantine Demiurus thought about Catherine Alexander. He remembered how beautiful she had been when he had first met her. She had been bright and funny and high-spirited, excited about being in 3F, Greece. She had everything, Demiurus thought. And then the gods had taken their vengeance. Catherine had been married to one of his pilots, and their marriage had become a living hell almost overnight. She had aged 10 years and become a fat, blousy drunk. Demiurus sighed. What a waste. Demiurus was seated in Sister Teresa's office. I hated to bother you about this, Sister Teresa apologized, but the child has nowhere to go in. You did the right thing, Constantine Demiurus assured her. Does she remember anything of her past? Sister Teresa shook her head. No. The poor dear. She walked over to the window where several nuns were working in the garden. She's out there now. Constantine Demiurus moved to her side and looked out the window. There were 3 nuns, their backs to him. He waited. One of them turned, and he could see her face, and his breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful. What had happened to that fat, ravaged woman? She's the one in the middle, Sister Teresa said. Demiurus nodded. Yes. Sister Teresa's words were truer than she knew. What do you want me to do with her? Careful. Let me think about it, Demiurus said. Till be in touch with you. Constantine Demiurus had a decision to make. Catherine Alexander's appearance had caught him by surprise. She had changed so completely. No one would know it's the same woman, he thought. And the idea that came into his head was so diabolically simple that he almost laughed aloud. That evening he dispatched a note to Sister Teresa. It's a miracle, Catherine thought. A dream come true. Sister Teresa had stopped by her tiny cell after matins. I have some news for you, child. Yes. Sister Teresa chose her words carefully. Good news. I have written to a friend of the convent about you, and he wishes to help you. Catherine could feel her heart leap. Help me how? That is something he will have to tell you. But he is a very kind and generous man. You will be leaving the convent. And the words sent a sudden, unexpected chill through Catherine. She would be going out into a strange world she could not even remember. And who was her benefactor? All Sister Teresa would say was, he is a very caring man, you should be grateful. His car will be here for you Monday morning. Catherine was unable to sleep for the next 2 nights. The idea of leaving the convent and going into the world outside was suddenly terrifying. She felt naked and lost. Perhaps I'm better off not knowing who I am. Please God, keep an eye on me. On Monday, the limousine arrived outside the convent gate at 7 o'clock in the morning. Catherine had been awake all night thinking about the unknown future that lay ahead of her. Sister Teresa walked her to the gate that led to the world outside. "We will pray for you. Remember, if you decide to come back to us, you will always have a place here. Thank you, sister. All remember." But in her heart, Catherine was sure that she was never going to return. The long drive from Ioannina to Athens filled Catherine with a series of conflicting emotions. It was tremendously exciting to be outside the gates of the convent, and yet there was something ominous about the world beyond. Was she going to learn what terrible thing had happened in her past? Did it have anything to do with her recurring dream that someone was trying to drown her? Pluses JIT. In the early afternoon, the countryside gave way to small villages 5 feet, and finally they reached the outskirts of Athens, and soon were in the middle of the bustling city. It all seemed strange and unreal to Catherine, and yet oddly familiar. "I've been here before," Catherine thought excitedly. The driver headed east, and 15 minutes later they reached an enormous estate high on a hill. They drove through a tall iron gate and a stone gatehouse, up a long driveway lined with majestic cypress trees, and stopped before a large white Mediterranean villa framed by half a dozen magnificent statues. The chauffeur opened the car door for Catherine and she stepped out. Ma was waiting at the front door. Calimera. The word for GOCTOF fling sprang to Catherine's lips unbidden. Calimera. Are you the person I've come to sp 9 feet t 1 foot? Oh no. Mr. Demiris is waiting for you in the library. I 23 Demiris. It was a name she had never heard before. Why was he interested in helping her? Catherine followed the man through an enormous rotunda, with a domed roof set in plaques of wedgewood. The floors were of creamy Italian marble. The living room was huge, with a high-beamed ceiling, and large, comfortable couches and chairs everywhere. A huge canvas, a dark and glowering Goya, covered one entire wall. As they approached the library, the man stopped. "Mr. Demiris is waiting for you inside." The walls of the library were white and gold boiserie, and the shelves lining the walls were filled with leather books embossed in gold. A man was seated behind a huge desk. He looked up as Catherine entered, and rose. He searched for a sign of recognition on her face, but there was none. "Welcome. 1 a.m. Constantine Demiris. What is your name?" He made the question sound casual. Did she remember her name? Catherine Alexander. He showed no reaction. "Welcome, Catherine Alexander. Please sit down." He took a seat opposite her, on a black leather couch. She was even lovelier close up. "She's magnificent," Demiris thought. "Even dressed in that black habit. It's a shame to destroy anything that beautiful. At least she will die happy." It's very kind of you to see me," Catherine said. "I don't understand why you." He smiled, genially. "It's really quite simple. From time to time I help out Sister Teresa. The convent has very little money, and I do what I can. When she wrote me about you and asked if I could be helpful, I told her that I would be happy to try." "That's very. Single quote." She stopped, not knowing how to continue. "Did Sister Teresa tell you that I've lost my memory?" "Yes, she did mention something about that." He paused and asked offhandedly, "How much do you remember?" "I know my name, but I don't know where I came from, or who I really am." She added, hopefully, "Perhaps I can find someone here in Athens who knows me." Constantine Demiris felt a sudden frisson of alarm. That was the last thing in the world he wanted. "That's possible, of course," he said carefully. "Why don't we discuss it in the morning? Unfortunately I have to attend a meeting now. I've arranged to have a suite prepared for you here. I think you'll be comfortable." I really don't know how to thank you." He waved a hand. "That isn't necessary. You will be well taken care of here. Just make yourself at home." "Thank you, Mr. Single quote. My friends call me Costa." A housekeeper led Catherine into a fantastic bedroom suite, done in soft shades of white, furnished with an oversized bed with a silk canopy, white couches and armchairs, antique tables and lamps, and impressionist paintings on the walls. Pale shutters of sea green kept the luring sun at bay. Through the windows, Catherine could see the turquoise sea below in the distance. The housekeeper said, "Mr. Demiris has arranged to have some clothes sent here for your approval. You are to select whatever you like." Catherine was conscious, for the first time, that she was still wearing the habit given her at the convent. Thank you. She sank down in the soft bed, feeling as though she were in a dream. Who was this stranger, and why was he being so kind to her? An hour later a van pulled up, filled with clothes. A couturier was ushered into Catherine's bedroom. I'm Madame Demas. Let's see what we have to work with. Would you get undressed, please? I beg your pardon. Will you get undressed? I can't tell much about your figure under those clothes. How long had it been since she had been naked in front of another person? Catherine began to take off her clothes, moving slowly, feeling self-conscious. When she stood nude in front of the woman, Madame Demas looked her over with a practiced eye. She was impressed. You have a fine figure. I think we're going to be able to do very well for you. Two female assistants walked in with boxes of dresses, underwear, blouses, skirts, shoes. Select whatever you like, the Couture Plus. Rhys said. And we'll try them on. I can't afford any of these, Catherine protested. I have no money. The Couture Plus one-half Rhys laughed. I don't think money will be a problem. Mr. Demirous is taking care of it. But why? The fabrics brought back tactile memories of clothes she must have once worn. There were silks and tweeds and cottons, in an array of exquisite colors. The three women were quick and efficient, and 2 hours later Catherine had half a dozen beautiful outfits. It was overwhelming. She sat there, not knowing what to do with herself. I'm all dressed up, she thought, with no place to go. But there was some place to go: into the city. The key to whatever had happened to her was in Athens. She was convinced of it. She stood up. Come on, stranger. We're going to try to find out who you are. Catherine wandered out into the front hall, and a butler approached her. May I help you, miss? Yes. I would like to go into the city. Could you call a taxi for me? I'm sure that won't be necessary, miss. We have limousines at your disposal. I will arrange a driver for you. Catherine hesitated. Thank you. Would Mr. Demirous be angry if she went into the city? He had not said not to. A few minutes later she was seated in the back of a Daimler limousine headed for downtown Athens. Catherine was dazzled by the noisy, bustling city, and the poignant succession of ruins and monuments that appeared all around her. The driver pointed ahead and said proudly, that is the Parthenon, mission top of the Acropolis. Catherine stared up at the familiar white marble building, dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She heard herself 4 feet saying 4. The driver smiled approvingly. Are you a student of Greek history, miss? Tears of frustration blurred Catherine's vision. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know. They were passing another ruin. That is the theater of Herod's Atticus. As you can see, parts of the walls are still standing. It once seated more than 5,000 people. 6,257, Catherine said softly. Modern hotels and office buildings were everywhere amid the timeless ruins, an exotic mixture of the past and present. The limousine passed a large park in the center of the city, with sparkling, dancing fountains in the middle. Dozens of tables with green and orange poles lined the park, and the air above them was carpeted with blue awnings. I've seen this before, Catherine thought, her hands growing cold. And I was happy. There were outdoor cafes on almost every block, and on the corners men were selling freshly caught sponges everywhere. Flowers were being sold by vendors, their booths a rage of violently colored blossoms. The limousine had reached Syntagma Square as they passed a hotel on the corner. Catherine called out, "Stop, please." The driver pulled over to the curb. Catherine was finding it difficult to breathe. Recognize this hotel? I've stayed here. When she spoke, her voice was shaky. I'd like to get out here. I wonder if you could pick me up in 2 hours. Of course, miss. The chauffeur hurried to open the door for her, and Catherine stepped outside into the hot summer air. Her legs were trembling. Are you all right, miss? She had no answer. She felt as though she were on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an unknown, terrifying abyss. She moved through the crowds, marveling at the hordes of people hurrying through the streets, creating a roaring din of conversation. After the silence and solitude of the convent, everything seemed unreal. Catherine found herself moving toward the Plaka, the old section of Athens in the heart of the city, with its twisted alleys and crumbling, worn-down stairways that led to tiny houses, coffee shops, and whitewashed, rambling structures. She found her way by some instinct she did not understand nor try to control. She passed a taverna on top of a roof, overlooking the city, and stopped, staring. I've sat at that table. They handed me a menu in Greek. There were 3 of us. What would you like to eat? They had asked would you mind ordering for me. I'm afraid I might order the proprietor. They had laughed. But who were they? A waiter approached Catherine. Boro na sas voithaso. Ochi epharisto. Can I help you? No, thank you. How did I know that? Am I Greek? Catherine hurriedly moved on, and it was as though someone were guiding her. She seemed to know exactly where to go. Everything seemed familiar. And nothing. My God, she thought. I'm going crazy. I'm hallucinating. She passed a cafe that said Triflinkas. A memory was nagging at the corners of her mind. Something had happened to her here, something important. She could not remember what. She walked through the busy, winding streets and turned left at Vukoristio. It was filled with smart stores. Used to shop here. She started to cross the street, and a blue sedan raced around the corner, barely missing her. She could recall a voice saying, "The Greeks haven't made the transition to automobiles. In their hearts they're still driving donkeys." If you want insight into the Greeks, don't read the guidebooks, read the old Greek tragedies. We're filled with grand passions, deep joys and great sorrows, and we haven't learned how to cover them up with a civilized veneer. Who had said that to her? A man was hurrying down the street, walking toward her, staring at her. He slowed, a look of recognition on his face. He was tall and dark and Catherine was sure she had never seen him before and yet. Hello. He seemed very pleased to see her. Hello. Catherine took a deep breath. Do you know me? He was grinning. Of course I know you. Catherine felt her heart leap. She was finally going to learn the truth about the past. But how do you say, who am F to A, stranger in a crowded street, could we talk? Catherine asked. I think we'd better. Catherine was on the edge of panic. The mystery of her identity was about to be solved. And yet she felt a terrible fear. What if I don't want to know? What if I've done something dreadful? The man was leading her toward a small open-air taverna. I'm so glad I ran into you, he said. Catherine swallowed. So am I. A waiter led them to a table. What would you like to drink? The man asked. She shook her head. Nothing. There were so many questions to ask. Where do I begin? You're very beautiful, the man said. This is fate. Don't you agree? Yes. She was almost trembling with excitement. She took a deep breath. Where did we meet? He grinned. Is that important? Courtsim in El Paris, or Rome, at the races, at a party. He reached forward and pressed her hand. You're the prettiest one I've seen around here. How much do you charge? Catherine stared at him, not understanding for a moment, then shocked, she sprang to her feet. Hey. What's the matter? I'll pay you whatever. Catherine turned and fled, running down the street. She turned a corner and slowed down, her eyes filled with tears of humiliation. Ahead was a small taverna with a sign in the window that read, Madame Pirie's fortune teller. Catherine slowed, then stopped. No, Madame Pirie's. I've been here before. Her heart began to race. She sensed that here, through the darkened doorway, was the beginning of the end of the mystery. She opened the door and stepped inside. It took her several moments to get used to the cavernous darkness of the room. There was a familiar bar in the corner, and a dozen tables and chairs. A waiter walked up to her and addressed her in Greek, Kalimera. Kalimera. Who in a Madame Pirie's? Madame Pirie's. The waiter gestured toward an empty table in the corner of the room, and Catherine walked over and sat down. Everything was exactly as she remembered it. An incredibly old woman, dressed in black, with a face desiccated into angles and planes, was moving toward the table. What can I? ? She stopped, peering into Catherine's face. Her eyes opened wide. I knew you once, but your face. ... She gasped. You've come back. You know who I am? Catherine asked eagerly. The woman was staring, her eyes filled with horror. No, you're dead. Get out. Catherine moaned faintly and felt the hair on her scalp begin to rise. Please, I just. ... Go, Mrs. Douglas. I have to know. The old woman made the sign of the cross, turned, and fled. Catherine sat there for a moment, trembling, then rushed out into the street. The voice in her head followed her. Mrs. Douglas. And it was as though a floodgate opened up. Dozens of brightly lighted scenes suddenly poured into her head, a brilliant series of kaleidoscopes out of control. I'm Mrs. Larry Douglas. She could see her husband's handsome face. She had been madly in love with Hinef, but something had gone wrong. Something. The next image was of herself trying to commit suicide, and waking up in a hospital. Catherine stood in the street, afraid her legs would not carry her, letting the pictures come tumbling into her mind. She had been drinking a lot, because she had lost Larry. But then he had come back to her. They were at her apartment, and Larry was saying, "I know how badly I've behaved. I'd like to make it up to you, Kathy. I love you. I've never really loved anyone else. I want another chance. How would you like to go away on a second honeymoon? I know a wonderful little place we can go. It's called Loanina." And then the horror had begun. The pictures that came into her mind now were terrifying. She was on a mountain top with Larry, lost in a swirling gray mist, and he was moving toward her, his arms outstretched, ready to push her off the edge. At that moment, some tourists arrived and saved her. And then the caves. The hotel clerk told me about some caves near here. All the honeymooners go there. And they had gone to the caves, and Larry had taken her deep into the bowels of them, and left her there to die. She put her hands over her ears as if to shut out the terrible thoughts that were rushing at her. She had been rescued and taken back to the hotel, and a doctor had given her a sedative. But in the middle of the night she had awakened and heard Larry and his mistress in the kitchen, planning her murder, the wind whipping away their words. "No one will ever one told you I'd take care of went wrong. There's nothing they can now." While she's asleep, and she remembered running away in that terrible storm, and pursued by them, getting into the rowboat, the wind lashing the boat into the middle of the stormy lake. The boat had started to sink, and she had lost consciousness. Catherine sank onto a street bench, too exhausted to move. So her nightmares had been real. Her husband and his mistress had tried to kill her. She thought again about the stranger who had come to visit her at the convent shortly after her rescue. He had handed her an exquisitely made golden bird, its wings poised for flight. "No one will harm you now. The wicked people are dead." She could still not see his face clearly. Catherine's head began to throb. Finally, she rose and slowly walked toward the street where she was to meet the driver who would take her back to Constantine Demiris, where she would be safe. Chapter 4 Feet. "Why did you let her leave the house?" Constantine Demiris demanded. "I'm sorry, sir," the butler replied. "You didn't say anything about her not leaving, so." Demiris forced himself to appear calm. "It's not important, she'll probably be back soon. Is there anything else, sir?" "No." Demiris watched the butler go. He walked over to a window and stared out at the impeccably manicured garden. It was dangerous for Catherine Alexander to appear in the streets of Athens, where someone might recognize her. "It's too bad I can't afford to let her live. But first, my vengeance. She'll stay alive 5F until I take my revenge. I'm going to enjoy myself with her. I'll send her away from here, somewhere where no one will know I her. London will be safe. We can keep an eye on her. I'll give her a job at my offices there." An hour later, when Catherine returned to the house, Constantine Demiris could sense instantly the change in her. It was as though some dark curtain had been lifted and Catherine had suddenly come alive. She was wearing an attractive white silk suit, with a white blouse, and Demiris was taken aback by how much her appearance had changed. "Nostami," he thought. "Sexy, Mr. Demiris. Costa. I know who I am, and what happened." His face revealed nothing. "Really? Sit down, my dear, and tell me." Catherine was too excited to sit. She began to pace jerkily on the carpet, back and forth, the words tumbling out of her. "My husband and his mistress, Noelle, tried to kill me." She stopped, looking at him anxiously. "Does that sound crazy? I don't know. Maybe it is. Go on, my dear," he said soothingly. "Some nuns from the convent saved me." "My husband worked for you, didn't he?" she blurted out. Demiris hesitated, carefully weighing his answer. "Yes." How much should he tell her? "He was one of my pilots. I felt a sense of responsibility toward you. That's only. She faced him. "But you knew who I was. Why didn't you tell me this morning?" "I was afraid of the shock," Demiris said smoothly. "I thought it better to let you discover things for yourself. Do you know what happened to my husband and that woman?" "Where are they?" Demiris looked into Catherine's eyes. "They were executed." He watched the blood drain from her face. She made a small sound. She suddenly felt too weak to stand and sank into a chair. They were executed by the state, Catherine." "But, why? Careful. Danger. Because they tried to murder you." Catherine frowned. "I don't understand. Why would the state execute them?" I'm alive. Single quote. He broke in. Catherine, Greek laws are very strict. And justice here is swift. They had a public trial. A number of witnesses testified that your husband and Noel Page attempted to kill you. They were convicted, and sentenced to death. It's hard to believe. Catherine sat there, dazed. The trial Constantine Demiris walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder. You must put the past out of your mind. They tried to do an evil thing to you, and they paid for it. He struck a more buoyant tone. I think you and I should discuss the future. Do you have any plans? She did not hear him. Larry, she thought. Larry's handsome face, laughing. Larry's arms, his voice. Catherine. Single quote. She looked up. TM sorry. Have you had any thoughts about your future? No, I don't know what I'm going to do. I suppose I could stay in Athens. Single quote. No, Demiris said firmly. That wouldn't be a good idea. It would bring back too many unpleasant memories. I would suggest that you leave Greece. But I have nowhere to go. I've given it some thought, Demiris told her. I have offices in London. You once worked for a man named William Fraser in Washington. Do you remember that? William? Single quote. And suddenly she did remember it. That had been one of the happiest times of her life. You were his administrative assistant, I believe. Yes, I. Single quote. You could do the same job for me in London. She hesitated. I don't know. I don't want to seem ungrateful, but. Single quote. M5*IV, I understand. I know everything seems to be happening very quickly, Demiris said sympathetically. You need some time to think about all this. Why don't you have a nice quiet dinner in your room, and in the morning we'll discuss it further. Asking her to have dinner in her room was a last-minute inspiration. He could not afford to have his wife run into her. You're very thoughtful, Catherine said. And very generous. No, the clothes are. Single quote. Greater than. He patted her hand and held it a fraction longer than necessary. It's my pleasure. She sat in her bedroom watching the blazing sun set over the blue Aegean in an explosion of color. There is no point in reliving the past. There is the future to think about. Thank God for Constantine Demiris. He was her lifeline. Without him, she would have had no one to turn to. And he had offered her a job in London. Am I going to take it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. We've brought your dinner, miss. Long after Catherine had gone, Constantine Demiris sat in the library, thinking about their conversation. Noel. Only once in his life had Demiris permitted himself to lose control of his emotions. He had fallen deeply in love with Noel Page, and she had become his mistress. He had never known a woman like her. She was knowledgeable about art, and music, and business, and she had become indispensable. Nothing about Noel surprised him. Everything about Noel surprised him. He was obsessed with her. She was the most beautiful, the most sensual woman Demiris had ever known. She had given up stardom to be at his side. Noel had stirred emotions in him that he had never felt before. She was his lover, his confidant, his friend. Demiris had trusted her completely and she had betrayed him with Larry Douglas. It was a mistake Noel had paid for with her life. Constantine Demiris had arranged with the authorities for her body to be buried on the grounds of the cemetery on Sara, his private island in the Aegean. Everyone had remarked on what a beautiful, sentimental gesture it was. In fact, Demiris had arranged for the burial plot to be there so that he could have the exquisite pleasure of walking over the bitch's grave. At Demiris' bedside in his own bedroom was a photograph of Noel at her loveliest, looking up at him and smiling. Forever smiling, frozen in time. Even now, more than a year later, Demiris was unable to stop thinking about her. She was an open wound that no doctor could ever heal. Why, Noel, why? I gave you everything. I loved you, you bitch. I loved you. One loved you. And then there was Larry Douglas. He had paid with his life, but that was not enough for Demiris. He had another vengeance in mind. A perfect one. He was going to take his pleasure with Douglas's wife as Douglas had done with Noel. Then he would send Catherine to join her husband. Costa. It was his wife's voice. Melina walked into the library. Constantine Demiris was married to Melina Lambro, an attractive woman from an old, aristocratic Greek family. She was tall and regal-looking, with an innate dignity. Costa, who is the woman I saw in the hall? Her voice was tense. The question caught him off guard. What? Oh. She's a friend of a business associate, Demirous said. She's going to work for me in London. I caught a glimpse of her. She reminds me of someone. Really? Yes. Melina hesitated. She reminds me of the wife of the pilot who used to work for you. But that's impossible, of course, they murdered her. Yes, Konstantin Demirous agreed. They murdered her. He watched Melina as she walked away. He would have to be careful. Melina was no fool. Never should have married her, Demirous thought. It was a bad mistake. 10 years earlier, the wedding of Melina Lambro and Konstantin Demirous had sent shock waves through business and social circles from Athens to the Riviera to Newport. What had made it so titillating was that only 1 month before the wedding the bride had been engaged to marry another man as a child. Melina Lambro had dismayed her family by her willfulness. When she was 10, she decided she wanted to be a sailor. The family chauffeur found her at the harbor, trying to sneak aboard a ship, and brought her home in disgrace. At 12, she tried to run away with a traveling circus. By the time Melina was 17, she was resigned to her fate. She was beautiful, fabulously wealthy and the daughter of Mihalis Lambro. The newspapers loved to write about her. She was a fairy tale figure whose playmates were princesses and princes, and through it all, by some miracle, Melina had managed to remain unspoiled. Melina had one brother, Spiros, who was 10 years older than she, and they adored each other. Their parents had died in a boating accident when Melina was 13, and it was Spiros who had reared her. Spiros was extremely protective of her, too much so, Melina thought. As Melina reached her late teens, Spiros became even more wary about Melina's suitors, and he carefully examined each candidate for his sister's hand. Not one of them proved to be good enough. You have to be careful, he constantly counseled Melina. You're a target for every fortune hunter in the world. You're young and rich and beautiful, and you bear a famous name. Bravo, my dear brother. That will be of immense comfort to me, when I'm 80 years old and die an old maid. Don't worry, Melina. The right man will come along. His name was Count Vasilis Manos, and he was in his middle 40s, a successful businessman from an old and distinguished Greek family. The Count had fallen instantly in love with the beautiful young Melina. His proposal came only a few weeks after they met. He's perfect for you, Spiros said happily. Manos has his feet on the ground, and he's crazy about you. Melina was less enthusiastic. He's not exciting, Spiros. When we're together, all he talks about is business, business, business. I wish he were more romantic. Her brother said firmly, there's more to marriage than romance. You want a husband who is solid and stable, someone who will devote himself to you. And finally Melina was persuaded to accept Count Manos' proposal. The Count was thrilled. You've made me the happiest man in the world, he declared. I've just formed a new company. I'm going to name it Melina International. She would have preferred a dozen roses. The wedding date was set, 1,000 invitations were sent out, and elaborate plans were made. It was then that Konstantin Demirous entered Melina Lambro's life. They met at one of the dozen or so engagement parties that were being given for the betrothed pair. The hostess introduced them. This is Melina Lambro. Konstantin Demirous. Demirous stared at her with his brooding black eyes. How long will they let you stay? He asked. I beg your pardon. Surely you've been sent from the heavens to teach us mortals what beauty is. Melina laughed. You're very flattering, Mr. Demirous. Greater than. He shook his head. You're beyond flattery. Nothing I could, I say, would do you justice. At that moment Count Manos approached and interrupted the conversation. That night, just before falling asleep, Melina thought about Demirous. She had heard about him, of course. He was wealthy, he was a widower, and he had the reputation of being a ruthless businessman and a compulsive womanizer. I'm glad I'm not involved with him, Melina thought. The gods were laughing. The morning after the party, Melina's butler walked into the breakfast room. A package has arrived for you, Miss Lambro. It was delivered by Mr. Demirous' chauffeur. Bring it in, please. So Konstantin Demirous thinks he's going to impress me with his wealth. Well, he's in for a big disappointment. Whatever he's sent, whether it's an expensive piece of jewelry or some priceless antique, I'm going to send it right back to him. The package was small and oblong, and beautifully wrapped. Curious, Melina opened it. The card read, simply, I thought you might enjoy this. Konstantin. It was a leather-bound copy of Tota Raba by Nikos Kazantzakis, her favorite author. How could he have known? Melina wrote a polite thank you note, and thought. That's that. The following morning, another package arrived. This time it was a recording by Delius, her favorite composer. The note read, "You might enjoy listening to this while reading Tota Raba." From that day on there were gifts every day. Her favorite flowers, and perfume, and music, and books. Constantine Demiris had taken the trouble to find out what Melina's tastes were, and she could not help but be flattered by his attention. When Melina telephoned to thank Demiris, he said, "There's nothing I could ever give you that would do you justice." How many women had he said that to before? "Will you have lunch with me, Melina?" She started to say no, and then thought, can't hurt to have lunch with the man. He's been very thoughtful, very well. When she mentioned to Count Manos that she was having lunch with Constantine Demiris, he objected. "What's the point, my dear? You have nothing in common with that terrible man. Why are you going to see him? Vasilis, he's been sending me little gifts every day. I'm going to tell him to stop." And even as Melina said it, she thought, could have told him that over the telephone. Constantine Demiris had made reservations at the popular Flocka restaurant on Panepistemio Street, and he was waiting for Melina. When she arrived he rose. "You're here. I was so afraid you might change your mind. I always keep my word." He looked at her and said solemnly, "And I keep mine. I'm going to marry you." Melina shook her head, half amused, half annoyed. "Mr. Demiris, I'm engaged to marry someone else." "Manos." He waved a hand in dismissal. "He's not right for you." "Oh, really? And why is that?" "I've checked on him. Insanity runs in his family. He's a hemophiliac, he's wanted by the police on a sex charge in Brussels, and he plays a dreadful game of tennis." Melina could not help laughing. "And you?" "I don't play tennis." "I see. And that's why I should marry you." "No. You'll marry me because I'm going to make you the happiest woman who ever lived." "Mr. Demiris." He covered her hand with his. "Costa. JTJ. She withdrew her hand. "Mr. Demiris, I came here today to tell you that I want you to stop sending me gifts. I don't intend to see you again." He studied her for a long moment. "I'm sure you are not a cruel person." "I hope not." He smiled. "Good. Then you won't want to break my heart." "I doubt if your heart is that easily broken. You have quite a reputation." "Ah, that was before I met you. I've dreamed about you for a long time." Melina laughed. Serious. "When one was a very young man, I used to read about the Lambro family. You were very rich and I was very poor. I had nothing. We lived from hand to mouth. My father was a stevedore who worked on the docks of Piraeus. I had 14 brothers and sisters, and we had to fight for everything we wanted." In spite of herself, she was touched. "But now you were rich." "Yes. Not as rich as I am going to be." "What made you rich?" "Hunger. I was always hungry. I'm still hungry." She could read the truth in his eyes. How did you get started? Do you really want to know?" And Melina found herself saying, "I really want to know. When I was 17, I went to work for a small oil company in the Middle East. I was not doing very well. One night I had dinner with a young geologist who worked for a large oil company. I ordered a steak that night, and he ordered only soup. I asked him why he didn't have a steak, and he said it was because he had no back teeth, and he couldn't afford to buy dentures. I gave him $50 to buy new teeth. A month later he telephoned me in the middle of the night to tell me he had just discovered a new oil deposit. He hadn't told his employer about it yet. In the morning, I started borrowing every cent I could, and by evening I had bought options on all the land around the new discovery. It turned out to be one of the biggest oil deposits in the world." Melina was hanging on his every word, fascinated. "That was the beginning. I needed tankers to ship my oil in, so in time I acquired a fleet. Then a refinery. Then an airline." He shrugged. "It went on from there." It was not until long after they were married that Melina learned that the story about the steak was pure fiction. Melina Lambro had no intention of seeing Constantine Demiris again. But, by a series of carefully arranged coincidences, Demiris invariably managed to appear at the same party, or theater, or charity event that Melina was attending. And each time, she felt his overpowering magnetism. Beside him, Vasilis Manos seemed, she hated to admit it, even to herself, boring. Melina Lambro was fond of the Flemish painters, and when Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow came on the market, before she could purchase it, Konstantin Demiris sent it to her as a gift. Melina was fascinated by his uncanny knowledge of her tastes. "I can't accept such an expensive gift from you," she protested. "Ah, but it's not a gift. You must pay for it. Dinner with me tonight." And she had finally agreed. The man was irresistible. A week later Melina broke off her engagement to Count Manos. When Melina told her brother the news he was stunned. "Why, in heaven's name?" Spiros asked. "Why?" "Because I'm going to marry Konstantin Demiris." He was aghast. "You must be crazy. You can't marry Demiris, he's a monster. He'll destroy you. If. You're wrong about him, Spiros. He's wonderful. And we're in love. It's. You're in love," he snapped. "I don't know what he's after, but it has nothing to do with love. Do you know what his reputation is with women? He. That's all in the past, Spiros. I'm going to be his wife." And there was nothing he could do to talk his sister out of the wedding. A month later Melina Lambrou and Konstantin Demiris were married. In the beginning it seemed to be a perfect marriage. Konstantin was amusing and attentive. He was an exciting and passionate lover, and he constantly surprised Melina with lavish gifts and trips to exotic places. On the first night of their honeymoon, he said, "My first wife was never able to give me a child. Now we'll have many sons. No daughters." Melina teased, "If you wish. But a son first." The day Melina learned she was pregnant, Konstantin was ecstatic. "He will take over my empire," he declared happily. In her third month, Melina miscarried. Konstantin Demiris was out of the country when it happened. When he returned and heard the news he reacted like a madman. "What did you do?" he screamed. "How could it happen? Costa, You were careless." "No, I swear." He took a deep breath. "All right. What's done is done. We'll have another son." I can't." She could not meet his eyes. "What are you saying?" "They had to perform an operation. I can't have another child." He stood there, frozen, then turned and stalked out without a word. From that moment on, Melina's life became a hell. Konstantin Demiris carried on as though his wife had deliberately killed his son. He ignored her, and began seeing other women. Melina could have borne that, but what made the humiliation so painful was the pleasure he took in publicly flaunting his liaisons. He openly had affairs with movie stars, opera singers, and the wives of some of his friends. He took his lovers to Sara and on cruises on his yacht, and to public functions. The press gleefully chronicled Konstantin Demiris' romantic adventures. They were at a dinner party at the house of a prominent banker. "You and Melina must come," the banker had said. "I have a new Oriental chef who makes the best Chinese food in the world." The guest list was prestigious. At the dinner table was a fascinating collection of artists, politicians and industrialists. The food was indeed wonderful. The chef had prepared shark fin soup, shrimp rolls, Mushu pork, Peking duck, spare ribs, Canton noodles and a dozen other dishes. Melina was seated near the host, at one end of the table, her husband next to the hostess at the other end. To Demiris' right was a pretty young film star. Demiris was concentrating on her, ignoring everyone else at the table. Melina could hear snatches of his conversation. "When you finish your picture, you must come on my yacht. It will be a lovely vacation for you. We'll cruise along the Dalmatian coast." Melina tried not to listen, but it was impossible. Demiris made no effort to keep his voice down. "You've never been to Sara, have you? It's a lovely little island, completely isolated. You'll enjoy it." Melina wanted to crawl under the table. But the worst was yet to come. They had just finished the spare rib course, and the butlers were bringing silver finger bowls. As a finger bowl was placed in front of the young star, Demiris said, "You won't need that." And, grinning, he lifted her hands in his and began slowly licking the sauce from her fingers, one by one. The other guests averted their eyes. Melina rose to her feet and turned to her host. "If you'll excuse me, I have a headache." The guests watched as she fled from the room. Demiris did not come home that night, or the next. When Spiros heard about the incident, he was livid. "Just give me the word," Melina's brother fumed, "and I'll kill the son of a bitch." "He can't help it," Melina defended him. "It's his nature. His nature. He's an animal. He should be put away. Why don't you divorce him?" It was a question Melina Demiris had asked herself often in the still of the long, lonely nights she spent by herself. And it always came down to the same answer. Love him. At 5:30 in the morning, Catherine was awakened by an apologetic maid greater than R. Good morning, miss. Catherine opened her eyes and looked around in confusion. Instead of her tiny cell at the convent, she was in a beautiful bedroom inn. Her memory came flooding back. The trip into Athens. You're Catherine Douglas. They were executed by the state. Miss. Yes. Mr. Demirous asked if you would join him for breakfast on the terrace. Catherine stared up at her sleepily. She had been awake until 4 o'clock, her mind in a turmoil. Thank you. Tell Mr. Demirous I'll be right there. 20 minutes later a butler escorted Catherine to an enormous terrace facing the sea. There was a low stone wall that overlooked the gardens 20 feet below. Constantine Demirous was seated at a table, waiting. He studied Catherine as she walked toward him. There was an exciting innocence about her. He was going to take it, possess it, make it his. He imagined her naked in his bed, helping him punish Noel and Larry again. Demirous rose. Good morning. Forgive me for awakening you so early, but I must leave for my office in a few minutes, and I wanted the opportunity for us to have a little chat first. Yes, of course, Catherine said. She sat down at the large marble table opposite him, facing the sea. The sun was just rising, showering the sea with 1,000 sparkles. What would you like for breakfast? She shook her head. I'm not hungry. Some coffee perhaps. Thank you. The butler was pouring hot coffee into a Bellique cup. Well, Catherine, Demirous began. Have you thought about our conversation? Catherine had thought of nothing else all night. There was nothing left for her in Athens, and she had nowhere else to go. Won't go back to the convent, she vowed. The invitation to work for Constantine Demirous in London sounded intriguing. In fact, Catherine admitted to herself, it sounds exciting. It could be the beginning of a new life. Yes, Catherine said, I have. And I think I would like to try it. Constantine Demirous managed to conceal his relief. I'm delighted. Have you ever been to London? No. That is, I don't think so. Why don't I know for sure? There were still so many frightening gaps in her memory. How many more surprises am I going to get? It's one of the few civilized cities left in the world. I'm sure you'll enjoy it very much. Catherine hesitated. Mr. Demirous, why are you going to all this trouble for me? Let's just say it's because I feel a sense of responsibility. He paused. I introduced your husband to Noel Page. Ah, Catherine said slowly. Noel Page. The name sent a small shiver through her. The two of them had died for each other. Larry must have loved her so much. Catherine forced herself to ask a question that had been tormenting her all night long. How were they executed? There was a small pause. They were shot by a firing squad. Oh. She could feel the bullets tearing into Larry's flesh, ripping apart the body of the man she had once loved so much. She was sorry she had asked. Let me give you some advice. Don't think about the past. It can only be hurtful. You must put all that behind you. Catherine said slowly, you're right. I'll try. Good. I happen to have a plane flying to London this morning. Catherine. Can you be ready to leave in a little while? Catherine thought of all the trips she had taken with Larry. The excited preparations, the packing, the anticipation. This time, there would be no one to go with, little to pack, and nothing to prepare for. Yes, I can be ready. Excellent. By the way, Demirous said casually, now that your memory has returned, perhaps there's someone you'd like to get in touch with, someone from your past whom you would like to let know that you're all right. The name that instantly sprang to her mind was William Fraser. He was the only one in the world who remained from her past. But she knew she was not ready to face him yet. When I get settled, Catherine thought. When I start working again, I'll get in touch with him. Constantine Demirous was watching her, waiting for her answer. No, Catherine said finally. There's no one. She had no idea that she had just saved William Eraser's life. I'll arrange a passport for you. He handed her an envelope. This is an advance on your salary. You won't have to worry about a place to live. The company has a flat in London. You'll stay there. It was overwhelming. You're much too generous. He took her hand in his. You'll find that I'm. He changed what he was going to say. Handle her carefully, he thought. Slowly. You don't want to scare her away. That I can be a very good friend. You are a very good friend. Demirous smiled. Wait. 2 hours later, Constantine Demirous helped Catherine into the back seat of the Rolls-Royce that was to take her to the airport. Enjoy London, he said. Till be in touch with you. 5 minutes after the car had departed, Demiris was on the telephone to London. She's on her way. Chapter 5. The plane was scheduled to leave from Hellenikon Airport at 9:00 am. It was a Hawker Siddeley, and to Catherine's surprise, she was the only passenger. The pilot, a pleasant-faced, middle-aged Greek named Pantelis, saw to it that Catherine was comfortably seated and buckled in. "We'll be taking off in just a few minutes," he informed her. "Thank you." Catherine watched him walk into the cockpit to join the co-pilot, and her heart suddenly began to beat faster. "This is the plane that Larry flew. Had Noel Page sat in the seat I am now sitting in." Catherine suddenly felt as though she were going to faint. The walls began to close in on her. She shut her eyes and took a deep breath. "That's all over," she thought. "Demiris is right. That's the past and nothing can change it." She heard the roar of the engines, and opened her eyes. The plane was lifting off, heading northwest toward London. How many times had Larry made this flight? Larry. She was shaken by the mixture of emotions that his name brought. And the memories. The wonderful, terrible memories. It was the summer of 1940, the year before America got into the war. She had been fresh out of Northwestern University, and had gone from Chicago to Washington, D.C. For her first job. Her roommate had said, "Hey, I heard about a job opening that might interest you." One of the girls at the party said she's quitting to go back to Texas. She works for Bill Fraser. He's in charge of public relations for the State Department. "I just heard about it last night, so if you get over there now, you should beat all the other girls to it." Catherine had raced over, only to find Eraser's reception office already packed with dozens of applicants for the job. Haven't a chance, Catherine thought. The door to the inner office opened and William Fraser emerged. He was a tall, attractive man, with curly, blonde hair, graying at the temples, bright blue eyes, and a strong, rather forbidding jawline. He said to the receptionist, "I need a copy of Life. The issue that came out 3 or 4 weeks ago. It has a picture of Stalin on the cover." "Till order it, Mr. Fraser," the receptionist said. "Sally, I have Senator Bora on the line. I want to read him a paragraph from that issue. You have 2 minutes to find a copy for me." He went into his office and closed the door. The applicants looked at one another and shrugged. Catherine stood there, thinking hard. She turned and pushed her way out of the office. She heard one of the women say, "Good. That's one down." 3 minutes later, Catherine returned to the office with the old copy of Life with a picture of Stalin on the cover. She handed it to the receptionist. 5 minutes later, Catherine found herself seated in William Fraser's office. "Sally tells me that you came up with the Life magazine." "Yes, sir. I assume you didn't just happen to have a 3-week-old issue in your purse." "No, sir. How did you find it so quickly?" "I went down to the barber shop." Barber shops and dentists' offices always have old issues lying around. "Are you that bright about everything?" "No, sir. We'll find out," William Fraser said. She was hired. Catherine enjoyed the excitement of working for Fraser. He was a bachelor, wealthy and social, and he seemed to know everyone in Washington. Time magazine had called him the most eligible bachelor of the year. 6 months after Catherine started to work for William Fraser, they fell in love in his bedroom. Catherine said, "I have to tell you something, I'm a virgin." Fraser shook his head in wonder. "That's incredible. How did I wind up with the only virgin in the city of Washington?" One day William Fraser said to Catherine, "They've asked our office to supervise an Army Air Corps recruiting film they're shooting at MGM Studios in Hollywood. I'd like you to handle the picture while I'm in London." Bill, I can't even load a brownie. What do I know about making a training film?" Fraser grinned. "About as much as anyone else. You don't have to worry. They have a director. His name is Alan Benjamin. The Army plans to use actors in the film." "Why?" "I guess they feel that soldiers won't be convincing enough to play soldiers." "That sounds like the Army." And Catherine had flown to Hollywood to supervise the training film. The soundstage was filled with extras, most of them in ill-fitting Army uniforms. "Excuse me," Catherine said to a man passing by. "Is Mr. Alan Benjamin here?" "The little corporal." He pointed. "Over there." Catherine turned and saw a slight, frail-looking man in a uniform with corporal's stripes. He was screaming at a man wearing a general's stars. "Fuck what the casting director said. I'm up to my ass in generals. I need non-coms." He raised his hands in despair. "Everybody wants to be a chief, nobody wants to be an Indian." "Excuse me," Catherine said. "I'm Catherine Alexander." "Thank God," the little man said. "You take over. I don't know what I'm doing here. I had a $3,500 a year job in Dearborn editing a furniture trade magazine, and I was drafted into the Signal Corps and sent to write training films. What do I know about producing or directing? This is all yours." He turned and hurried toward the exit, leaving Catherine standing there. A lean, gray-haired man in a sweater moved toward her, an amused smile on his face. "Need any help?" "I need a miracle," Catherine said. "I'm in charge of this, and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing." He grinned at her. "Welcome to Hollywood. I'm Tom O'Brien, the assistant director. Do you think you could direct this?" She saw the corner of his lips twist. "I could try. I've done 6 pictures with Willie Wyler. The situation isn't as bad as it looks. All it needs is a little organization. The script's written, and the set's ready." Catherine looked around the soundstage. "Some of these uniforms look terrible. Let's see if we can't do better." O'Brien nodded approvingly. "Right." Catherine and O'Brien walked over to the group of extras. The din of conversation on the enormous stage was deafening. "Let's hold it down, boys," O'Brien yelled. "This is Miss Alexander. She's going to be in charge here." Catherine said. "Let's line up, so we can take a good look at you, please." O'Brien formed the men into a ragged line. Catherine heard laughter and voices nearby and turned in annoyance. One of the men in uniform stood in a corner, paying no attention, talking to some girls who were hanging on his every word and giggling. The man's manner irritated Catherine. "Excuse me. Would you mind joining the rest of us?" He turned and asked, lazily, "Are you talking to me?" "Yes. We'd like to go to work." He was extraordinarily handsome, tall and wiry, with blue-black hair and stormy dark eyes. His uniform fitted perfectly. On his shoulders were the bars of a captain, and across his breast he had pinned on a splash of brightly colored ribbons. Catherine stared at them. "Those medals. Are they impressive enough, boss?" His voice was deep and filled with insolent amusement. "Take them off." "Why? I thought I'd give this film a little color." "There's one little thing you forgot. America's not at war yet. You'd have had to have won those at a carnival." "You're right," he admitted sheepishly. "I didn't think of that. I'll take some of them off." "Take them all off," Catherine snapped. After the morning's shooting, while Catherine was having lunch at the commissary, he walked up to her table. "I wanted to ask you how I did this morning. Was I convincing?" His manner infuriated her. "You enjoy wearing that uniform and strutting around the girls, but have you thought about enlisting?" He looked shocked. "And get shot at? That's for suckers." Catherine was ready to explode. "I think you're contemptible." "Why? If you don't know why, I could never explain it to you." "Why don't you try? At dinner tonight. Your place. Do you cook?" "Don't bother coming back to the set," Catherine snapped. "Tell Mr. O'Brien to send you your check for this morning's work." "What's your name?" "Douglas. Larry Douglas." The experience with the arrogant young actor rankled Catherine, and she was determined to put it out of her mind. For some reason, she found it difficult to forget him. When Catherine returned to Washington, William Fraser said, "I missed you. I've been doing a lot of thinking about you. Do you love me?" "Very much, Bill. I love you too. Why don't we go out tonight and celebrate?" Catherine knew that that was the night he was going to propose. They went to the exclusive Jefferson Club. In the middle of dinner, Larry Douglas walked in, still wearing his Army Air Corps uniform with all the medals. Catherine watched unbelievingly as he walked over to their table and greeted not her, but Fraser. Bill Fraser rose. "Kathy, this is Captain Lawrence Douglas. Larry, this is Miss Alexander." Catherine. "Larry's been flying with the RAF. He was the leader of the American squadron over there. They talked him into heading up a fighter base in Virginia to get some of our boys ready for combat." Like the rerun of an old movie, Catherine remembered how she had ordered him to take off his bars and his medals, and how he had cheerfully obliged. She had been smug, overbearing, and she had called him a coward. She wanted to crawl under the table. The next day, Larry Douglas telephoned Catherine at her office. She refused to take his calls. When she finished work, he was outside, waiting for her. He had taken off his medals and ribbons and was wearing the bars of a second lieutenant. He smiled and walked up to her. "Is this better?" Catherine stared at him. Isn't wearing the wrong insignia against regulations?" "I don't know. I thought you were in charge of all that." She looked into his eyes and knew that she was lost. There was a magnetic force about him that was irresistible. "What do you want from me?" "Everything. I want you." They had gone to his apartment and made love. And it was an exquisite joy that Catherine had never dreamed possible, a fantastic coming together that rocked the room and the universe until there was an explosion that became a delirious ecstasy, an unbelievable shattering journey, an arriving and a departing, an ending and a beginning. And she had lain there, spent and numb, holding him tightly, never wanting to let him go, never wanting this feeling to stop. They were married 5 hours later, in Maryland. Now, seated in the plane, on her way to London to begin a new life, Catherine thought, "We were so happy. Where did it all go wrong?" The romantic movies and the love songs tricked us all into believing in happy endings and knights in shining armor and love that never, never died. We really believed that James Stewart and Donna Reed had a wonderful life, and we knew that Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert would be together forever after it happened one night, and we shed tears when Frederick March returned to Myrna Loy for the best years of our lives, and we were sure that Joan Fontaine found happiness in the arms of Laurence Olivier and Rebecca. And they were lies. All lies. And the songs. "I'll be loving you, always." How do men figure always? With an egg timer. How deep is the ocean? What did Irving Berlin have in mind? 1 foot, 2 feet, and forever and a day. I'm leaving. I want a divorce. Some enchanted evening. Come on. We're going to climb Mount Zumurka. You and the night and the music. The hotel manager told me about some caves near here. I love you for sentimental reasons. No one will ever. Now while she's asleep, be my love. And we listened to the songs, and we watched the movies and really thought that was what life was going to be like. I believed in my husband so much. Can I ever believe in anyone again? What did I do to make him want to murder me, Miss Alexander? Single quote. Catherine looked up, startled, unfocused. The pilot was standing over her. We've landed. Welcome to London. There was a limousine waiting for Catherine at the airport. The chauffeur said, I'll arrange for your luggage, Miss Alexander. My name is Alfred. Would you like to go directly to your flat? My flat. Yes, that will be fine. Catherine sank back in her seat. Unbelievable. Konstantin Demiris had arranged a private plane for her, and a place to live. He was either the most generous man in the world, or she simply could not think of any alternative. No, he's the most generous man in the world. I'll have to find a suitable way to show my appreciation. The flat, on Elizabeth Street off Eaton Square, was utterly luxurious. It consisted of a large entrance hall, a beautifully furnished drawing room, with a crystal chandelier, a paneled library, a kitchen stocked with food, 3 attractively furnished bedrooms, and servants' quarters. Catherine was greeted at the door by a woman in her 40s, wearing a black dress. Good afternoon, Miss Alexander. I am Anna. I am your housekeeper. Of course, my housekeeper. Catherine was beginning to take it all in stride. How do you do? The chauffeur brought Catherine's suitcases in and placed them in her bedroom. The limousine is at your disposal, he told her. Just tell Anna when you're ready to go to the office, and I will pick you up. The limousine is at my disposal. Naturally. Thank you, Anna said, till unpack your bags. If there's anything else you need, just let me know. I can't think of a thing, Catherine said honestly. Catherine wandered around the flat until Anna had finished unpacking. She went into the bedroom and looked at the beautiful new dresses that Demiris had bought her, and thought, all this is like a wonderful dream. There was a feeling of total unreality about it. 48 hours ago, she had been watering rose bushes at the convent. Now she was living the life of a duchess. She wondered what the job would be like. I'll work hard. I don't want to let him down. He's been so wonderful. She felt suddenly tired. She lay down on the soft, comfortable bed. I'll just rest a minute, she thought. She closed her eyes. She was drowning, and screaming for help. And Larry was swimming toward her, and when he reached her he pushed her underwater. And she was in a dark cave, and bats were coming at her, tearing at her hair, beating their clammy wings against her face. Catherine awakened with a shuddering start and sat up in bed, trembling. She took deep breaths to steady herself. That's enough, she thought. It's over. That was yesterday. This is today. No one's going to hurt you. No one. Not anymore. Outside Catherine's bedroom, Anna, the housekeeper, had been listening to the screams. She waited a moment, and when there was silence she walked down the hall and picked up the telephone to report to Konstantin Demiris. The Hellenic Trade Corporation was located at 217 Bond Street, off Piccadilly, in an old government building that had been converted years earlier to offices. The exterior of the building was a masterpiece of architecture, elegant and graceful. When Catherine arrived, the office staff was waiting for her. There were half a dozen people near the door to greet her. "Welcome, Miss Alexander. I'm Evelyn Kay. This is Carl, Tucker, Matthew, Jenny." The names and faces became a blur. "How do you do? Your office is ready for you. I'll show you the way." "Thank you." The reception room was tastefully furnished, with a large Chesterfield sofa, flanked by 2 Chippendale chairs and a tapestry. They walked down a long carpeted corridor and past a conference room with heavy pine paneling and leather chairs along a highly polished table. Catherine was ushered into an attractive office, with worn, comfortable furniture and a leather couch. "It's all yours." "It's lovely," she murmured. There were fresh flowers on the desk. "From Mr. Demiris. He's so thoughtful." Evelyn Kay, the woman who had shown her into the office, was a stocky, middle-aged woman with a pleasant face and a comfortable manner. "It will take you a few days to get used to the place, but the operation is really quite simple. We're one of the nerve centers of the Demiris Empire. We coordinate the reports from the overseas divisions, and send them on to headquarters in Athens. I'm the office manager. You'll be my assistant." "Oh, so I'm the assistant to the office manager." Catherine had no idea what was expected of her. She had been thrown into a fantasy world. Private planes, limousines, a beautiful flat with servants. "Wim Vandien is our resident mathematical genius. He computes all the statements and puts them into a master financial analysis chart. His mind works faster than most calculating machines. Come along to his office and meet him." They walked down the corridor to an office at the end of the hall. Evelyn opened the door without knocking. "Wim, this is my new assistant." Catherine stepped into the office and stood there, riveted. Wim Vandien appeared to be in his early 30s, a thin man with a slack-jawed mouth, and a dull, vacant expression. He was staring out the window. Wim, this is Catherine Alexander." He turned around. Catherine the First's real name was Marta Skowronka. She was a servant girl born in 1684 who was captured by the Russians. She married Peter I and was Empress of Russia from 1725 to 1727. Catherine the Great was the daughter of a German prince. She was born in 1729 and she married Peter, who became Emperor Peter III in 1762, and she succeeded to his throne that same year after she had him murdered. Under her reign there were 3 divisions of Poland and 2 wars against Turkey. The information poured out like a fountain, in a monotone. Catherine was listening, stunned. That's very interesting," she managed. Wim Vandien looked away. Evelyn said, "Wim is shy when he meets people." "Shy?" Catherine thought. "The man is weird. And he's a genius. What kind of job is this going to be?" In Athens, in his offices on Agios Garanda Street, Konstantin Demiris was listening to a telephone report from Alfred in London. "I drove Miss Alexander directly from the airport to the flat, Mr. Demiris. I asked her if she wished me to take her anywhere else, as you suggested, and she said no. She's had no outside contacts at all." "No, sir. Not unless she made some telephone calls from the flat, sir." Konstantin Demiris was not worried about that. Anna, the housekeeper, would report to him. He replaced the receiver, satisfied. She presented no immediate danger to him and he would see that she was watched. She was alone in the world. She had no one to turn to except her benefactor, Konstantin Demiris. Must make arrangements to go to London soon, Demiris thought happily. Very soon. Catherine Alexander found her new job interesting. Daily reports came in from Konstantin Demiris' far-flung empire. There were bills of lading from a steel mill in Indiana, audits from an automobile factory in Italy, invoices from a newspaper chain in Australia, a gold mine, an insurance company. Catherine collated the reports and saw to it that the information went directly to Wim Vandien. Wim glanced at the reports once, put them through the incredible computer that was his brain, and almost instantly calculated the percentages of profit or loss to the company. Catherine enjoyed getting to know her new colleagues and she was awed by the beauty of the old building she worked in. She mentioned it to Evelyn Kay once in front of Wim and Wim said, this was a government custom house designed by Sir Christopher Wren in 1721. After the Great Fire of London, Christopher Wren redesigned 50 churches including St. Paul's, St. Michael's, and St. Bride's. He designed the Royal Exchange and Buckingham House. He died in 1723 and is buried in St. Paul's. This house was converted to an office building in 1907, and in the Second World War during the Blitz, the government declared it an official air raid shelter. The air raid shelter was a large, bomb-proof room located through a heavy iron door adjoining the basement. Catherine looked into the heavily fortified room, and thought about the brave British men and women and children who had found shelter here during the terrible bombing by Hitler's Luftwaffe. The basement itself was huge, running the entire length of the building. It had a large boiler for heating the building, and was filled with electronic and telephone equipment. The boiler was a problem. Several times, Catherine had escorted a repairman down to the basement to take a look at it. Each one would tinker with it, pronounce it cured of whatever had ailed it, and leave. "It looks so dangerous," Catherine said. "Is there any chance that it might explode?" "Bless your heart, miss, of course not. See this safety valve here? Well, if the boiler should ever get too hot, the safety valve releases all the excess steam, and Bob's your uncle. No problem." After the workday was over, there was London. London, a cornucopia of wonderful theatre, ballet and music concerts. There were interesting old bookstores like Hatchard's, and Foyle's, and dozens of museums, and little antique shops, and restaurants. Catherine visited the lithograph shops in Cecil Court and shopped at Harrods, Fortnum and Mason, and Marks and Spencer, and had Sunday tea at the Savoy from time to time. Unbidden thoughts came into Catherine's mind. There were so many things to remind her of Larry. A voice, a phrase, a cologne, a song. No, the past is finished. The future is what's important. And each day she became stronger. Catherine and Evelyn Kay became friends and occasionally went out together. One Sunday they visited the open-air art exhibition on the Thames Embankment. There were dozens of artists there, young and old, displaying their paintings, and they all had one thing in common: they were failures who had been unable to have their works exhibited in any gallery. The paintings were terrible. Catherine bought one out of sympathy. "Where are you going to put it?" Evelyn asked. "In the boiler room," Catherine said. As they walked along the London streets, they came across the pavement artists, men who used colored chalks to paint on the stone of the pavement. Some of their work was amazing. Passers-by would stop to admire them and then toss a few coins to the artists. One afternoon on her way back from lunch, Catherine stopped to watch an elderly man working on a beautiful landscape in chalk. As he was finishing it, it began to rain and the old man stood there watching his work being washed away. "That's a lot like my past life," Catherine thought. Evelyn took Catherine to Shepherd Market. "This is an interesting area," Evelyn promised. It was certainly colorful. There was a 300-year-old restaurant called Titty Dole's, a magazine stand, a market, a beauty parlor, a bakery, antique shops, and several 2- and 3-story residences. The name plates on the mailboxes were odd. One read, "Helen," and below it, "French lessons." Another read, "Rosie," and, below that, "Greek taught here." "Is this an educational area?" Catherine asked. Evelyn laughed aloud. "In a way I guess it is. Only the kind of education these girls give can't be taught in school." Evelyn laughed even louder when Catherine blushed. Catherine was alone most of the time, but she kept herself too busy to be lonely. She plunged into her days as though trying to make up for the precious moments of her life that had been stolen from her. She refused to worry about the past or the future. She visited Windsor Castle, and Canterbury with its beautiful cathedral, and Hampton Court. On weekends, she went into the country and stayed at quaint little inns and took long walks through the countryside. "I'm alive," she thought. "No one is born happy. Everyone has to make his own happiness. I'm a survivor. I'm young and I'm healthy and wonderful things are going to happen." On Monday she would go back to work. Back to Evelyn and the girls and Wim Vandeen. Wim Vandeen was an enigma. Catherine had never met anyone like him. There were 20 employees in the office, and without even bothering to use a calculator, Wim Vandeen remembered every employee's salary, national insurance number, and deductions. Although all of this was on file, he kept all the company records in his head. He knew the monthly cash flow from each division and how it compared with the previous months, going back 5 years when he had started with the company. Wim Vandeen remembered everything he had ever seen or heard or read. The range of his knowledge was incredible. The simplest questions on any subject would trigger a stream of information, yet he was antisocial. Catherine discussed him with Evelyn. "I don't understand Wim at all. Wim is an eccentric," Evelyn said. You just have to take him as he is. All he's interested in is numbers. I don't think he cares about people. Does he have friends? No. Does he ever date? I mean go out with girls. No. It seemed to Catherine that Wim was isolated and lonely, and she felt a kinship with him. Wim's range of knowledge amazed Catherine. One morning, she developed an earache. Wim said gruffly, "This weather's not going to help it much, you'd better go and see an ear doctor." "Thanks, Wim. Single quote. The parts of the ear are the auricle, auditory meatus, tympanic membrane, the chain of ossicles hammer, anvil and stirrup tympanic cavity, the semicircular duct, oval window, the eustachian tube, auditory nerve, and the cochlear duct." And he walked away. On another day, Catherine and Evelyn took Wim to lunch at the Ram's Head, a local pub. In the back room, customers were throwing darts. "Are you interested in sports, Wim?" Catherine asked. "Have you ever seen a baseball game?" "Baseball," Wim said. "A baseball is 9¼ inches in circumference. It's made of yarn, wound on a hard rubber cone and covered with white leather. The bat is usually made of ash, not more than 2¾ inches in the greatest diameter, and not more than 42 inches in length." He knows all the statistics, Catherine thought, but has he ever felt the excitement of actually doing it? "Have you ever played any sports?" "Basketball, for instance." Basketball is played on a wooden or concrete floor. The ball has a spherical leather cover 31 inches in circumference, inflated by a rubber bladder to 13 pounds of pressure. It weighs 20 to 22 ounces. Basketball was invented by James Naismith in 1891. Catherine had her answer. Sometimes Wim could be an embarrassment in public. One Sunday, Catherine and Evelyn took Wim to Maidenhead, on the Thames. They stopped at the Complete Angler for lunch. The waiter came up to their table. "We have fresh clams today." Catherine turned to Wim. "Do you like clams?" Wim said, "There are long clams, quahog, or round clams, razor clams, surf clams, single shells, and blood clams." The waiter was staring at him. "Would you care to order some, sir?" "I don't like clams," Wim snapped. Catherine liked the people she was working with, but Wim became special to her. He was brilliant beyond her comprehension, and at the same time, he seemed withdrawn and lonely. Catherine said to Evelyn one day, "Isn't there some chance that Wim might lead a normal life? Fall in love and get married?" Evelyn sighed. "I told you. He has no emotions. He'll never get attached to anyone." But Catherine did not believe it. Once or twice she had caught a flash of interest, of affection, of laughter in Wim's eyes, and she wanted to draw him out, to help him. Or had it been her imagination? One day, the office staff received an invitation to a charity ball being held at the Savoy. Catherine walked into Wim's office. "Wim, do you dance?" He stared at her. A bar and a half of 4/4-time music completes one rhythmic unit in a foxtrot. The man starts the basic step with his left foot and takes 2 steps forward. The woman starts with her right foot and takes 2 steps backward. The 2 slow steps are followed by a quick step at right angles to the slow steps. To dip, the man steps forward on his left foot and dips slow, then he moves forward on his right foot slow. Then he moves to the left with his left foot quick, then closes his right foot to his left foot quick. Catherine stood there, not knowing what to say. He knows all the words, but he doesn't understand their meaning. Constantine Demiris telephoned. It was late at night and Catherine was preparing to go to bed. "I hope I didn't disturb you." "It's Costa." "No, of course not." She was glad to hear his voice. She had missed talking to him, asking his advice. After all, he was the only one in the world who really knew about her past. She felt as though he were an old friend. "I've been thinking about you, Catherine. I was concerned that you might find London a lonely place. After all, you don't know anyone there." "I do get a little lonely sometimes," Catherine admitted, "but I'm coping. I keep remembering what you said. Forget about the past, live for the future." "That's right. Speaking of the future, I'm going to be in London tomorrow. I would like to take you to dinner." "I would enjoy that very much," Catherine said warmly. She was looking forward to it. She would have a chance to tell him how grateful she was to him. When Constantine Demiris replaced the receiver, he smiled to himself. The chase is on. They had dinner at the Ritz. The dining room was elegant and the food was delicious. But Catherine was too excited to pay attention to anything except the man who was sitting opposite her. There was so much she had to tell him. "You have a wonderful office staff," Catherine said. "Wim is amazing. I've never seen anyone who can. Single quote. But Demirous was not listening to the words. He was studying her, thinking how beautiful she was, and how vulnerable. But I mustn't rush her, Demirous decided. No, I'll play the game slowly and savor the victory. This one will be for you, Noel, and for your lover. Are you going to be in London long? Catherine was asking. Just a day or two. I had some business to take care of. That was true. But he knew he could have handled it by telephone. No, he had come to London to begin his campaign to draw Catherine closer to him, to make her emotionally dependent on him. He leaned forward. Catherine, did I ever tell you about the time I worked in the oil fields in Saudi Arabia? Demirous took Catherine to dinner the following night. Evelyn told me what a wonderful job you're doing at the office. I'm going to give you a raise. You've been so generous already, Catherine protested. Single quote. Demirous looked into her eyes. You don't know how generous Lean be. Catherine was embarrassed. He's only being kind, she thought. Mustn't imagine things. The following day, Demirous was ready to leave. Would you like to ride out to the airport with me, Catherine? Yes. She found him fascinating, almost spellbinding. He was amusing and brilliant, and she was flattered by his attention at the airport. Demirous kissed Catherine lightly on the cheek. I'm glad we could spend some time together, Catherine. So am I, thank you, Costa. She stood there watching his plane take off. He's very special, Catherine thought. I'm going to miss him. Chapter 6. Everyone had always been amazed by the apparent close friendship of Constantine Demirous and his brother-in-law, Spiros Lambros. Spiros Lambros was almost as rich and powerful as Demirous. Demirous owned the largest fleet of cargo ships in the world. Spiros Lambros owned the second largest. Constantine Demirous controlled a chain of newspapers and airlines, oil fields, steel mills, and gold mines. Spiros Lambros had insurance companies, banks, enormous amounts of real estate, and a chemical plant. They seemed friendly competitors. Better than that, buddies. Isn't it wonderful, people said, that two of the most powerful men in the world are such great friends. In reality, they were implacable rivals who despised each other. When Spiros Lambros bought a 100-foot yacht, Constantine Demirous immediately commissioned a 150-foot yacht that had 4 GM diesels, a crew of 13, 2 speedboats and a freshwater swimming pool. When Spiros Lambros' fleet reached a total of 12 tankers, with a tonnage of 200,000, Constantine Demirous increased his own fleet to 23 tankers, with a tonnage of 650,000. Spiros Lambros acquired a string of race horses, and Demirous bought a larger stable to run against him, and consistently won. The two men saw each other frequently, for they served together on charity committees, sat on the boards of various corporations, and occasionally attended family gatherings. They were exactly opposite in temperament. Where Constantine Demirous had come from the gutter and fought his way to the top, Spiros Lambros was born an aristocrat. He was a lean and elegant man, always impeccably dressed, with courtly, old-world manners. He could trace his family tree back to Otto of Bavaria, who had once ruled as king of Greece. During the early political uprisings in Greece, a small minority, the oligarchy, amassed fortunes in trade, shipping and land. Spiros Lambros' father was one of them, and Spiros had inherited his empire over the years. Spiros Lambros and Constantine Demirous had carried on their charade of friendship. But each was determined that, in the end, he would destroy the other, Demirous because of his instinct for survival, Lambros because of his brother-in-law's treatment of Melina. Spiros Lambros was a superstitious man. He appreciated his good fortune in life, and he was anxious not to antagonize the gods. From time to time he consulted psychics for guidance. He was intelligent enough to recognize the frauds, but there was one psychic whom he had found to be uncanny. She had predicted his sister Melina's miscarriage and what would happen to the marriage, and a dozen other things that had come to pass. She lived in Athens. Her name was Madame Pires. Constantine Demirous made it a habit to arrive at his offices in Agio Garanda Street every morning punctually at 6 o'clock. By the time his rivals went to work, Demirous had already conducted several hours of business with his agents in a dozen countries. Demirous' private office was spectacular. The view was magnificent, with picture windows putting the city of Athens at his feet. The floor was black granite. The furniture was steel and leather. On the walls was a Cubist art collection, with L. Gers, Brocs, and half a dozen Picassos. There was an enormous glass and steel desk and a leather throne chair. On the desk was a death mask of Alexander the Great, set in crystal. The inscription under it read, Alexandra's. The defender of man. On this particular morning, Konstantin Demiris' private phone was ringing when he entered his office. There were only half a dozen people who had access to the telephone number. Demiris picked up the telephone. Calimera. Calimera. The voice at the other end belonged to Spiros Lambros' private secretary, Nikos Veritos. He sounded nervous. Forgive me for disturbing you, Mr. Demiris. You told me to call when I had some information that you might. Yes. What is for it? Mr. Lambro is planning to acquire a company called Aurora International. It is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Mr. Lambro has a friend on the board of directors who told him that a big government contract is going to be given to the company to build bombers. This is, of course, very confidential. The stock will have a big rise when the announcement. I'm not interested in the stock market, Demiris snapped. Don't bother me again unless you have something important to tell me. I'm sorry, Mr. Demiris. I thought. But Demiris had hung up. At 8 o'clock, when Demiris' assistant, Yanis Charos, I1 walked in, Konstantin Demiris looked up from his desk. There's a company on the New York Stock Exchange, Aurora International. Notify all our newspapers that the company is being investigated for fraud. Use an anonymous source, but spread the word. I want them to keep hammering at the story until the stock drops. Then start buying until I have control. Yes, sir. Is that all? No. After I've acquired control, announce that the rumors were unfounded. Oh, yes. See that the New York Stock Exchange is notified that Spiros Lambro bought his stock on insider information. Yanis Charos said delicately, Mr. Demiris, in the United States, that is a criminal offense. Konstantin Demiris smiled. I know. A mile away, at Syntagma Square, Spiros Lambro was working in his office. His workplace reflected his eclectic taste. The furniture consisted of rare antiques, a mixture of French and Italian. 3 of the walls were covered with the works of French Impressionists. The 4th wall was devoted to an array of Belgian artists, from Van Rysselberg to De Smet. The sign on the outer office door read, Lambro and Associates, but there had never been any associates. Spiros Lambro had inherited a successful business from his father, and over the years he had built it into a worldwide conglomerate. Spiros Lambro should have been a happy man. He was rich and successful, and he enjoyed excellent health. But it was impossible for him to be truly happy as long as Konstantin Demiris was alive. His brother-in-law was anathema to him. Lambro despised him. To him, Demiris was Polymykonos, a man fertile in devices, a scoundrel without morals. Lambro had always hated Demiris for his treatment of Melina, but the savage rivalry between them had its own terrible nexus. It had begun 10 years earlier, at a lunch Spiros Lambro had with his sister. She had never seen him so excited. Melina, did you know that every single day the world consumes all the fossil fuel it took 1,000 years to create? No, Spiros. There's going to be a tremendous demand for oil in the future, and there aren't going to be enough oil tankers to handle it. You're going to build some. He nodded. But not just ordinary tankers. I'm going to build the first fleet of large tankers. They'll be twice as large as the present ones. His voice was filled with enthusiasm. I've spent months going over the figures. Listen to this. A gallon of crude petroleum hauled from the Persian Gulf to an East Coast port of the United States cost 7 cents. But on a big tanker, the cost would come down to 3 cents a gallon. Do you have any idea what that could mean? Spiros, where are you going to get the money to build a fleet like that? He smiled. That's the beautiful part of my plan. It won't cost me a cent. What? He leaned forward. I'm going to America next month to talk to the heads of the big oil companies. With these tankers, I can carry their oil for them for half the price they can carry it. But, you don't have any big tankers. His smile turned into a grin. No, but if I can get long-term charter contracts own the oil companies, the banks will loan me the money I need to build them. What do you think? I think you're a genius. It's a brilliant plan. Melina was so excited about her brother's idea that she mentioned it too. Demiris that evening at dinner when she had finished explaining it, Melina said. Isn't that a wonderful idea? Konstantin Demiris was silent for a moment. Your brother's a dreamer. It could never work. Melina looked at him in surprise. Why not, Costa? Because it's a hair-brained scheme. In the first place, there's not going to be that big a demand for oil, so those mythical tankers of his will run empty. Secondly, the oil companies aren't about to turn their precious oil over to a phantom fleet that doesn't even exist. And third, those bankers he's going to will laugh him out of their offices. Melina's face clouded with disappointment. Spiros was so enthusiastic. Would you mind discussing it with him? Demurus shook his head. Let him have his dream, Melina. It would be better if he didn't even know about our conversation. All right, Costa. Whatever you say. Early the following morning, Constantine Demurus was on his way to the United States to discuss large tankers. He was aware that the world petroleum reserves outside the United States and the Soviet bloc territories were controlled by the Seven Sisters: Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, Standard Oil Company of California, Gulf Oil, the Texas Company, Socony Vacuum, Royal Dutch Shell and Anglo-Iranian. He knew that if he could get just one of them, the others were sure to follow. Constantine Demurus' first visit was to the executive offices of Standard Oil of New Jersey. He had an appointment with Owen Curtis, a fourth vice president. What can I do for you, Mr. Demurus? I have a concept that I think could be of great financial benefit to your company. Yes, you mentioned that over the telephone. Curtis glanced at his wristwatch. I have a meeting in a few minutes. If you could be brief. Till be very brief. It costs you 7 cents to haul a gallon of crude petroleum from the Persian Gulf to the eastern coast of the United States. That's correct. What would you say if I told you that I can guarantee to carry your oil for 3 cents a gallon? Curtis smiled patronizingly. And just how would you perform that miracle? Demurus said quietly, with a fleet of large tankers that will have twice the carrying capacity of the present ones. I can transport your oil as fast as you can pump it out of the ground. Curtis was studying him, his face thoughtful. Where would you get a fleet of large tankers? I'm going to build them. Sorry. We wouldn't be interested in investing in. Demurus interrupted. It won't cost you a penny. All I'm asking from you is a long-term contract to carry your oil at half the price you're paying now. I'll get my financing from the banks. There was a long, pregnant silence. Owen Curtis cleared his throat. I think I had better take you upstairs to meet our president. That was the beginning. The other oil companies were just as eager to make deals for Constantine Demurus' new tankers. By the time Spiros Lambro learned what was happening, it was too late. He flew to the United States and was able to make a few deals for large tankers with some independent companies, but Demurus had skimmed off the cream of the market. He's your husband, Lambro stormed, but I swear to you, Melina, someday I'm going to make him pay for what he's done. Melina felt miserable about what had happened. She felt she had betrayed her brother, but when she confronted her husband, he shrugged. I didn't go to them, Melina. They came to me. How could I refuse them? And that was the end of the discussion. But business considerations were unimportant compared to Lambro's feelings about how Demurus treated Melina. He could have shrugged off the fact that Constantine Demurus was a notorious philanderer after all. A man had to have his pleasure. But Demurus being so blatant about it was an insult not only to Melina but to the whole Lambro family. Demurus' affair with the actress, Noelle Page, had been the most egregious example. It had made headlines all over the world. One day, Spiros Lambro thought. One day, Nikos Veritos, Lambro's assistant, walked into the office. Vertos had been with Spiros Lambro for 15 years. He was competent, but unimaginative, a man with no future, gray and faceless. The rivalry between the two brothers-in-law presented Veritos with what he considered a golden opportunity. He was betting on Constantine Demurus to win, and from time to time he passed on confidential information to him, hoping for a suitable reward. Veritos approached Lambro. Excuse me. There's a Mr. Anthony Rizzoli here to see you. Lambro sighed. Let's get it over with, he said. Send him in. Anthony Rizzoli was in his mid-40s. He had black hair, a thin aquiline nose, and deep-set brown eyes. He moved with the grace of a trained boxer. He wore an expensive beige tailored suit, a yellow silk shirt and soft leather shoes. He was soft-spoken and polite, and yet there was something oddly menacing about him. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Lambro. Sit down, Mr. Rizzoli. Rizzoli took a seat. What can I do for you? Well, as I explained to Mr. Veritos here, I'd like to charter one of your cargo ships. You see, I have a factory in Marseille and I want to ship some heavy machinery to the United States. If you and me can work out a deal, I can throw a lot of business your way in the future." Spiros Lambros leaned back in his chair and studied the man seated in front of him. "Unsavory. Is that all you're planning to ship, Mr. Rizzoli?" he asked. Tony Rizzoli frowned. "What? I don't understand." "I think you do," Lambros said. "My ships are not available to you." "Why not? What are you talking about?" "Drugs, Mr. Rizzoli. You're a drug dealer." Rizzoli's eyes narrowed. "You're crazy. You've been listening to a lot of rumors." But they were more than rumors. Spiros Lambros had carefully checked out the man. Tony Rizzoli was one of the top drug smugglers in Europe. He was mafia, part of the organization, and the word was out that Rizzoli's transportation sources had dried up. That was why he was so anxious to make a deal. "I'm afraid you'll have to go elsewhere." Tony Rizzoli sat there, staring at him, his eyes cold. Finally he nodded. "Okay." He took a business card from his pocket and threw it on the desk. "If you change your mind, here's where you can reach me." He rose to his feet and a moment later he was gone. Spiros Lambros picked up the card. It read Anthony Rizzoli Import-Export. There was an Athens hotel address and a telephone number at the bottom of the card. Nikos Veritos had sat there wide-eyed, listening to the conversation. When Tony Rizzoli walked out the door he said, "Is he really?" ? "Yes. Mr. Rizzoli deals in heroin. If we ever let him use one of our ships, the government could put our whole fleet out of business." Tony Rizzoli walked out of Lambros' office in a fury. "That fucking Greek treating me like I'm some peasant off the street." And how had he known about the drugs? The shipment was an unusually large one, with a street value of at least $10 million. But the problem was in getting it to New York. The goddamned narcs are swarming all over Athens. I'll have to make a phone call to Sicily and stall. Tony Rizzoli had never lost a shipment, and he did not intend to lose this one. He thought of himself as a born winner. He had grown up in Hell's Kitchen in New York. Geographically, it was located in the middle of the west side of Manhattan, between 8th Avenue and the Hudson River, and its northern and southern boundaries ran from 23rd to 59th Streets. But psychologically and emotionally Hell's Kitchen was a city within a city, an armed enclave. The streets were ruled by gangs. There were the Gophers, the Parlor Mob, the Gorillas, and the Rhodes Gang. Murder contracts retailed at $100, with mayhem a little less. The occupants of Hell's Kitchen lived in dirty tenements, overrun by lice, rats and roaches. There were no bathtubs, and the youth solved the shortage in their own way. They plunged naked into the water off the Hudson River docks, where the sewers from the kitchen streets emptied into the river. The docks stank of the stagnant mass of dead, swollen cats and dogs. The street scene provided an endless variety of action. A fire engine answering an alarm. A gang fight on one of the tenement roofs. A wedding procession. A stickball game on the sidewalk. A chase after a runaway horse. A shooting. The only playgrounds the children had were the streets, the tenement roofs, the rubbish-strewn vacant lots, and in the summertime the noisome waters of the river. And over everything, the acrid smell of poverty. That was the atmosphere in which Tony Rizzoli had grown up. Tony Rizzoli's earliest memory was of being knocked down, and having his milk money stolen. He was 7 years old. Older and bigger boys were a constant threat. The route to school was a no-man's land, and the school itself was a battleground. By the time Rizzoli was 15 years old he had developed a strong body and considerable skill as a fighter. He enjoyed fighting, and because he was good at it, it gave him a feeling of superiority. He and his friends put on boxing matches at Stillman's gym from time to time. Some of the mobsters dropped in to keep an eye on the fighters they owned. Frank Costello appeared once or twice a month, along with Joe Adonis and Lucky Luciano. They were amused by the boxing matches that the youngsters put on, and as a form of diversion they began to bet on their fights. Tony Rizzoli was always the winner, and he quickly became a favorite of the mobsters. One day while Rizzoli was changing in the locker room the young boy overheard a conversation between Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano. "The kid's a gold mine," Luciano was saying. "I won $5 grand on him last week. You going to put a bet on his fight with Lou Dominic?" "Sure. I'm betting 10 big ones." "What odds do you have to lay?" 10 to 1. "But what the hell? Rizzoli's a shoe-in." Tony Rizzoli was not certain what the conversation meant. He went to his older brother, Gino, and told him about it. "Jesus!" his brother exclaimed. Those guys are bettin' big money on you. But why? I'm not a professional. Gino thought for a moment. You've never lost a fight, have you, Tony? No. What probably happened is that they made a few small bets for kicks, and then when they saw what you could do they began betting for real. The younger boy shrugged. It don't mean nothing to me. Gino took his arm and said earnestly, it could mean a lot to you. To both of us. Listen to me, kid. Single quote. 1. The fight with Lou Dominic took place at Stillman's gym on a Friday afternoon and all the big boys were there: Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lance Sky. They enjoyed watching the young boys fight, but what they enjoyed even more was the fact that they had found a way to make money on the kids. Lou Dominic was 17, a year older than Tony and 5 pounds heavier. But he was no match for Tony Rizzoli's boxing skills and killer instinct. The fight was 5 rounds. The first round went easily to young Tony. The second round also went to him. And the third. The mobsters were already counting their money. The kid's going to grow up to be a world champion, Lucky Luciano crowed. How much did you bet on him? 10 grand, Frank Costello replied. The best odds I could get was 15 to 1. The kid's already got a reputation. And suddenly, the unexpected happened. In the middle of the 5th round, Lou Dominic knocked out Tony Rizzoli with an uppercut. The referee began to count. Very slowly, looking apprehensively out at the stony-faced audience. Get to your feet, you little bastard, Joe Adonis screamed. Get up and fight. The counting went on, and even at that slow pace, it finally reached 10. Tony Rizzoli was still on the mat, out cold 11 feet, son of a bitch. One lucky punch. All the men began to add up their losses. They were substantial. Tony Rizzoli was carried to one of the dressing rooms by Gino. Tony kept his eyes tightly closed, afraid that they would find out he was conscious and do something terrible to him. It was not until Tony was safely home that he began to relax. We did it. His brother yelled excitedly. Do you know how much fucking money we made? Almost $1,000. I don't understand. Single quote. I borrowed money from their own Shylocks to bet on Dominic, and got 15 to 1 odds. We're rich. Won't they be mad? Tony asked. Gino smiled. They'll never know. The following day when Tony Rizzoli got out of school there was a long black limousine waiting at the curb. Lucky Luciano was in the back seat. He waved the boy over to the car. Get in. Tony Rizzoli's heart began to pound. I can't, Mr. Luciano, I'm late for. Single quote. Get in. Tony Rizzoli got into the limousine. Lucky Luciano said to the driver, go around the block. Thank God he wasn't being taken for a ride. Luciano turned to the boy. You took a dive, he said flatly. Rizzoli flushed. No, sir. Single quote. Don't shit me. How much did you make on the fight? Nothing, Mr. Luciano. Till ask you once more. How much did you make by taking that dive? The boy hesitated. $1,000. Lucky Luciano laughed. That's chicken feed. But I guess for a. How old are you? Almost 16. I guess for a 16-year-old kid, that ain't bad. You know you cost me and my friends a lot of money. I'm sorry. Forget it. You're a bright boy. You've got a future. Thank you. I'm going to keep quiet about this, Tony, or my friends will cut your nuts off and feed them to you. But I want you to come and see me Monday. You and me are going to work together. A week later, Tony Rizzoli was working for Lucky Luciano. Rizzoli started as a numbers runner, and then became an enforcer. He was bright and quick, and in time he worked himself up to being Luciano's lieutenant. When Lucky Luciano was arrested, convicted and sent to prison, Tony Rizzoli stayed on with Luciano's organization. The families were into gambling, shylocking, prostitution, and anything else in which there was an illegal profit to be made. Dealing drugs was generally frowned on, but some of the members insisted on being involved, and the families reluctantly gave them permission to set up drug trafficking on their own. The idea became an obsession with Tony Rizzoli. From what he had seen, the people who were in drug trafficking were completely disorganized. They're all spinning their wheels. With the right brains and muscle behind it, he made his decision. Tony Rizzoli was not a man to go into anything haphazardly. He began by reading everything he could find out about heroin. Heroin was fast becoming the king of narcotics. Marijuana and cocaine provided a high, but heroin created a state of complete euphoria, with no pain, no problems, no cares. Those enslaved by heroin were willing to sell anything they possessed, steal anything within their reach, commit any crime. Heroin became their religion. Their reason for being Turkey was one of the leading growers of the poppy from which heroin was derived. The family had contacts in Turkey, so Rizzoli had a talk with Pete Luca, one of the capos. "I'm going to get involved," Rizzoli said. "But anything I do will be for the family. I want you to know that. You're a good boy, Tony. I'd like to go to Turkey to look things over. Can you set it up?" The old man hesitated. "Till send word. But they're not like us, Tony. They have no morals. They're animals. If they don't trust you, they'll kill you. Till be careful. You do that." 2 weeks later, Tony Rizzoli was on his way to Turkey. He traveled to Izmir, Afyon, and Eskişehir, the regions where the poppies were grown, and in the beginning, he was greeted with deep suspicion. He was a stranger, and strangers were not welcome. "We're going to do a lot of business together," Rizzoli said. "T'd like to take a look at the poppy fields." A shrug. "I don't know nothing about no poppy fields. You're wasting your time. Go home." But Rizzoli was determined. Half a dozen phone calls were made and coded cables were exchanged. Finally, in Kilis, on the Turkish-Syrian border, he was allowed to watch the opium being harvested at the farm of Karela, one of the large landowners. "I don't understand it," Tony said. "How can you get heroin from a fucking flower?" A white-coated scientist explained it to him. "There are several steps, Mr. Rizzoli. Heroin is synthesized from opium, which is made by treating morphine with acetic acid. Heroin is derived from a particular strain of poppy plant called Papaver somniferum, the flower of sleep. Opium gets its name from the Greek word opos, meaning juice." Got you. At harvesting time, Tony was invited to visit Karela's main estate. Each member of Karela's family was equipped with a sizgi bitsik, a scalpel-shaped cutting knife, to make a precise incision into the plant. Karela explained, "The poppies have to be harvested within a 24-hour period or the crop is ruined." There were 9 members in the family and each one worked frantically to make sure the crop was in on time. The air was filled with fumes that induced drowsiness. Rizzoli felt groggy. "Be careful," Karela warned. "Stay awake. If you lie down in the field, you will never get up again." The farmhouse windows and doors were kept tightly closed during the 24-hour period of harvest. When the poppies had been picked, Rizzoli watched the sticky white gum transformed from a morphine base into heroin, at a laboratory in the hills. "So, that's it, huh?" Karela shook his head. "No, my friend. That's only the beginning. Making the heroin is the easiest part. The trick is to transport it without getting caught." Tony Rizzoli felt an excitement building in him. This was where his expertise was going to take over. Up until now, the business had been run by bunglers. Now he was going to show them how a professional operated. "How do you move this stuff?" "There are many ways. Truck, bus, train, car, mule, camel." Single quote. Camel. "We used to smuggle heroin in cans in the camel's belly until the guards started using metal detectors. So we switched to rubber bags. At the end of the trip we kill the camels. The problem is that sometimes the bags burst inside the camels, and the animals stagger up to the border like drunks. So the guards caught on. What route do you use? Sometimes the heroin is routed from Aleppo, Beirut and Istanbul, and on to Marseille. Sometimes the drugs go from Istanbul to Greece, then on to Sicily through Corsica and Morocco and across the Atlantic." "I appreciate your cooperation," Rizzoli said. Tell the boys I have another favor to ask of you." "Yes, I'd like to go along with the next shipment." There was a long pause. "That could be dangerous. Take my chances." The following afternoon, Tony Rizzoli was introduced to a large, hulking bandit of a man, with a grandiose, flowing mustache, and the body of a tank. "This is Mustafa from Afyon. In Turkish, Afyon means opium. Mustafa is one of our most skilled smugglers." "One has to be skilled," Mustafa said modestly. "There are many dangers." Tony Rizzoli grinned. "But it's worth the risk, eh?" Mustafa said with dignity, "You are speaking of money. To us, opium is more than a money crop. There is a mystique about it. It is the one crop that is more than food alone. The white sap of the plant is a God-given elixir which is a natural medicine if taken in small quantities. It can be eaten, or applied directly to the skin, and it will cure most of the common ailments: upset stomachs, colds, fever, aches, pains, sprains. But you must be careful. If you take it in large amounts, not only will it cloud the senses, it will rob you of your sexual prowess, and nothing in Turkey could more destroy a man's dignity than impotence. Sure. Anything you say. The journey from Afyon began at midnight. A group of farmers, walking single file through the black night, rendezvoused with Mustafa. The mules were loaded with opium, 350 kilos, more than 700 pounds, strapped to the backs of 7 stout mules. The sweet pungent odor of the opium, like wet hay, hovered in the air about the men. There were a dozen farmers who had come to guard the opium in the transaction with Mustafa. Each farmer was armed with a rifle. We have to be careful these days, Mustafa told Rizzoli. We have Interpol and many police looking for us. In the old days, it was more fun. We used to transport opium through a village or the city in a casket draped in black. It was a heartwarming sight to see the people and the police on the street, lifting their hats and saluting in respect as a coffin of opium went by. The province of Afyon lies in the center of the western third of Turkey at the foot of the Sultan Mountains on a high plateau, remote and virtually isolated from the nation's leading cities. This terrain is very good for our work, Mustafa said. We are not easy to find. The mules moved slowly through the desolate mountains, and at midnight, 3 days later, they reached the Turkish-Syrian border. There they were met by a woman dressed in black. She was leading a horse carrying an innocent sack of flour, and there was a hemp rope knotted loosely on its saddle horn. The rope trailed behind the horse, but it never touched the ground. It was a long rope, 200 feet in length. The other end was held up by Mustafa and his 15 hired runners behind him. They walked in a crouch, each bent over close to the ground, one hand holding the rope line, and the other clutching a gunny sack of opium. Each dollar ack weighed 35 pounds. The woman and her horse walked through a stretch booby-trapped with anti-personnel mines, but there was a path that had been cleared by a small herd of sheep driven through the area earlier. If the rope fell to the earth, the slack was a signal to Mustafa and the others that there were gendarmes up ahead. If the woman was taken in for questioning, then the smugglers would safely move on ahead across the border. They crossed at Kilis, the border point, which was heavily mined. Once past the area controlled by the gendarme patrols, the smugglers moved into the buffer zone 3 miles wide, until they reached their rendezvous, where they were greeted by Syrian smugglers. They put their sacks of opium on the ground and were presented with a bottle of raki, which the men passed from one to the other. Rizzoli watched as the opium was weighed, stacked, tied and secured upon the sway backs of a dozen dirty Syrian donkeys. The job was done all right, Rizzoli thought. Now let's see how the boys in Thailand do it. Rizzoli's next stop was Bangkok. When his bona fides had been established, he was allowed on a Thai fishing vessel that carried drugs wrapped in polyethylene sheeting packed into empty kerosene drums, with rings attached to the top. As the shipping boats approached Hong Kong, they jettisoned the drums in a neat row in shallow water around Lima and the Ladrone Islands, where it was simple for a Hong Kong fishing boat to pick them up with a grappling hook. Not bad, Rizzoli said. But there has to be a better way. The growers referred to heroin as they and horse, but to Tony Rizzoli, heroin was gold. The profits were staggering. The peasants who grew the raw opium were paid $350 for 10 kilos, but by the time the opium was processed and sold on the streets of New York, its value had increased to $250,000. It's so easy, Rizzoli thought. Carella was right. The trick is not to get caught. That had been in the beginning, 10 years earlier. But now it was more difficult. Interpol, the international police force, had recently put drug smuggling at the top of its list. All vessels leaving the key smuggling ports that looked even slightly suspicious were boarded and searched. That was why Rizzoli had gone to Spiros Lambro. His fleet was above suspicion. It was unlikely that the police would search one of his cargo ships. But the bastard had turned him down. I'll find another way, Tony Rizzoli thought. But I'd better find it fast. Catherine, am I disturbing you? It was midnight. No, Costa. It's nice to hear your voice. Is everything going well? Yes, thanks to you. I'm really enjoying my job. Good. I'll be coming to London in a few weeks. I'll look forward to seeing you. Careful. Don't push too fast. I want to discuss some of the company's personnel. Fine. Good night, then. Good night. This time she was calling him. Costa -1 don't know what to say. The locket is beautiful. You shouldn't have. Single quote. It's a small token, Catherine. Evelyn told me what a big help you are to her. I just wanted to express my appreciation. It's so easy, Demirous thought. Little gifts and flattery. Later, my wife and I are separating, then the "I'm so lonely" stage, a vague talk of marriage and an invitation to travel on his 84 IWCHT to his island. The routine never failed. This is going to be particularly exciting, Demirous thought, because it's going to have a zero different ending. She's going to die. He telephoned Napoleon Chodas. The lawyer was delighted to hear from him. It's been a while, Costa. Everything goes well. Yes, thank you. I need a favor. Of course. Noel Page owned a little villa in Rafina. I want you to buy it for me, under someone else's name. Certainly. I'll have one of the lawyers in my office. Single quote. I want you to handle it personally. There was a pause. Very well. I'll take care of it. Thank you. Napoleon Chodas sat there, staring at the phone. The villa was the love nest where Noel Page and Larry Douglas had carried on their affair. What could Konstantin Demirous possibly want with it? Chapter 7. The Arsakian Courthouse in downtown Athens is a large, gray stone building that takes up the entire square block at University Street and Strata. Of the 30 courtrooms in the building, only 3 rooms are reserved for criminal trials, rooms 21, 30 and 33. Because of the enormous interest generated by the murder trial of Anastasia Savalas, it was being held in room 33. The courtroom was 40 feet wide and 300 feet long, and the seats were divided into 3 blocks, 6 feet apart, with 9 wooden benches to each row. At the front of the courtroom was a raised dais behind a 6-foot mahogany partition, with high-backed chairs for the 3 presiding judges. In front of the dais was a witness stand, a small raised platform on which was fixed a reading lectern, and against the far wall was a jury box, filled now with its 10 jurors. In front of the defendant's box was the lawyer's table. The murder trial was spectacular enough in itself, but the pièce de résistance was the fact that the defense was being conducted by Napoleon Chodas, one of the preeminent criminal lawyers in the world. Chodas tried only murder cases, and he had a remarkable record of success. His fees were rumored to be in the millions of dollars. Napoleon Chodas was a thin, emaciated-looking man with the large sad eyes of a bloodhound in a corrugated face. He dressed badly, and his physical appearance did nothing to inspire confidence. But behind his vaguely baffled manner was hidden a brilliant, trenchant mind. The press had speculated furiously about why Napoleon Chodas had agreed to defend the woman on trial. There was no way he could possibly win the case. Wagers were being made that it would be Chodas' first defeat. Peter Demonides, the prosecuting attorney, had come up against Chodas before, and though he would never admit it, even to himself he was in awe of Chodas' skill. This time, however, Demonides felt that he had little to worry about. If ever there was a classic open and shut murder case, the Anastasia Savalas trial was it. The facts were simple. Anastasia Savalas was a beautiful young woman married to a wealthy man named George Savalas, who was 30 years her senior. Anastasia had been having an affair with their young chauffeur, Joseph Pappas, and, according to witnesses, her husband had threatened to divorce Anastasia and write her out of his will. On the night of the murder, she had dismissed the servants and prepared dinner for her husband. George Savalas had had a cold. During dinner, he had suffered a coughing spell. His wife had brought him his bottle of cough medicine. Savalas had taken one swallow and dropped dead. An open and shut case. Room 33 was crowded with spectators on this early morning. Anastasia Savalas was seated at the defendant's table dressed in a simple black skirt and blouse, with no jewelry and very little makeup. She was stunningly beautiful. The prosecutor, Peter Demonides, was addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes, in a murder case, a trial takes up to 3 or 4 months. But I don't think any of you are going to have to worry about being here for that length of time. When you hear the facts in this case, I'm sure you will greater than J agree without question that there is only one possible verdict: murder in the first degree. The state will prove that the defendant willfully murdered her husband because he threatened to divorce her when he found out she was having an affair with the family chauffeur. We will prove that the defendant had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to carry out her cold-blooded less-than-him scheme. Thank you. He returned to his seat. The Chief Justice turned toward Chodas, as the counsel for less than the defense prepared to make his opening statement. Napoleon Chodas rose slowly to his feet. Yes, Your Honor. He moved toward the jury box in an uncertain, shuffling gait. He stood there blinking at them, and when he spoke it was almost as though he were speaking to himself. I've lived a long time, and I've learned that no man or woman can hide an evil nature. It always shows. A poet once said that the eyes are the windows of the soul. I believe that's true. I want you ladies and gentlemen to look into the eyes of the defendant. There is no way she could have found it in her heart to murder anyone. Napoleon Chodas stood there a moment as though trying to think of something else to say, then shuffled back to his seat. Peter Demonides was filled with a sudden sense of triumph. Jesus Christ. "'Tis the weakest opening I have ever heard in my life. The old man's lost it." Is the prosecuting attorney prepared to call his first witness? "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call Rosa Lykorgos." A middle-aged, heavy-set woman rose from the spectators' bench and sailed determinedly toward the front of the courtroom. She was sworn in. "Mrs. Lykorgos, what is your occupation?" "I am the housekeeper." Single quote. Her voice choked up. "I was the housekeeper to Mr. Savalas." "Mr. George Savalas?" "Yes, sir." "And would you tell us how long you were employed by Mr. Savalas?" 25 years. "My, that's a long time. Were you fond of your employer?" "He was a saint." "Were you employed by Mr. Savalas during his first marriage?" "Yes, sir. I was at the graveside with him when his wife was buried." "Would it be fair to say that they had a good relationship?" "They were madly in love with each other." Peter Demonides looked over at Napoleon Chodas, waiting for his objection on the line of questioning. But Chodas remained in his seat, apparently lost in thought. Peter Demonides went on. "And were you in Mr. Savalas employed during his second marriage, to Anastasia Savalas?" "Oh, yes, sir. I certainly was." She spat the words out. "Would you say that it was a happy marriage?" Again he glanced at Napoleon Chodas, but there was no reaction. "Happy?" "No, sir. He fought like cats and dogs." "Did you witness any of these fights?" "A person couldn't help it. You could hear them all over the house, and it's a big house." "I take it these fights were verbal, rather than physical." "That is, Mr. Savalas never struck his wife." "Oh, it was physical all right. But it was the other way around. It was the madam who struck him. Mr. Savalas was getting on in years, and the poor man had become frail." "You actually saw Mrs. Savalas strike her husband?" "More than once." The witness looked over at Anastasia Savalas, and there was grim satisfaction in her voice. "Mrs. Lykorgos, on the night Mr. Savalas died, which members of the staff were working in the house?" "None of us." Peter Demonides let his voice register surprise. "You mean in a house that you say was so large, not one member of the staff was there?" "Didn't Mr. Savalas employ a cook, or a maid? A butler?" Single quote. "Oh, yes, sir. We had all of those. But the madam told everyone to take that night off. She said she wanted to cook dinner for her husband herself. It was going to be a second honeymoon." The last remark was said with a snort. So Mrs. Savalas got rid of everybody. This time it was the Chief Justice who looked over at Napoleon Chodas, waiting for him to object. But the attorney sat there, preoccupied. The Chief Justice turned to Demonides. "The prosecutor will stop leading the witness." "I apologize, Your Honor. I'll rephrase the question." Demonides moved closer to Mrs. Lykorgos. "What you are saying is that on a night when members of the staff ordinarily would be in the house, Mrs. Savalas ordered everyone to leave so that she could be alone with her husband?" "Yes, sir. And the poor man was suffering from a terrible cold." "Did Mrs. Savalas often cook dinner for her husband?" Mrs. Lykorgos sniffed. "Her? No, sir. Not her. She never lifted a finger around the house." And Napoleon Chodas sat there, listening as though he were merely a spectator. "Thank you, Mrs. Lykorgos. You've been very helpful." Peter Demonides turned to Chodas, trying to conceal his satisfaction. Mrs. Lykorgos' testimony had had a perceptible effect on the jury. They were casting disapproving glances at the defendant. "Let's see the old man try to get around that, Your Witness." Napoleon Chodas glanced up. "What? Oh, no questions." The Chief Justice looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Chodas, you don't wish to cross-examine this witness?" Napoleon Chodas rose to his feet. "No, Your Honor. She seems like a perfectly honest woman." He sat down again. Peter Demonides could not believe his good fortune. "My God," he thought, "he's not even putting up a fight. The old man's finished." Demonides was already savoring his victory. The Chief Justice turned to the prosecuting attorney. "You may call your next witness." The state would like to call Joseph Pappas. A tall, good-looking, dark-haired young man rose from the spectators' bench and walked toward the witness box. He was sworn in. Peter Demonides began. Mr. Pappas, would you please tell the court your occupation? I'm a chauffeur. Are you employed at the moment? No. But you were employed until recently. That is, you were employed until the death of George Savalas. That's right. How long were you employed by the Savalas family? A little over a year. Was it a pleasant job? Joseph Pappas had one eye on Chodas, waiting for him to come to his rescue. There was only silence. Was it a pleasant job, Mr. Pappas? It was okay, I guess. Did you get a goofed salary? Yes. Then wouldn't you say the job was more than okay? I mean, weren't there some extras that went along with it? Weren't you going to bed regularly with Mrs. Savalas? Joseph Pappas looked toward Napoleon Chodas for help. But there was none. Yes, sir. I guess I was. Peter Demonides was withering in his scorn. You guess you were. You're under oath. You either had an affair with her or you didn't. Which is it? Pappas was squirming in his seat. We had an affair. Even though you were working for her husband, being paid generously by him, and living under his roof. Yes, sir. It didn't bother you to take Mr. Savalas' money week after week while you were having an affair with his wife. It wasn't just an affair. Peter Demonides baited the trap carefully. It wasn't just an affair. What do you mean by that? I'm afraid I don't understand. I mean, me and Anastasia were planning to get married. There was a surprised murmur from the courtroom. The jurors were staring at the defendant. Was the marriage your idea, or Mrs. Savalas? Well, we both wanted to. Who suggested it? I guess she did. He looked over toward where Anastasia Savalas was seated. She returned his look without flinching. Frankly, Mr. Pappas, I'm puzzled. How did you expect to get married? Mrs. Savalas already had a husband, hadn't she? Did you plan to wait for him to die of old age? Or have a fatal accident of some kind? What exactly did you have in mind? The questions were so inflammatory that the prosecutor and the three judges looked toward Napoleon Chodas, waiting for him to thunder an objection. But the defense lawyer was busily doodling, paying no attention. Anastasia Savalas, too, was beginning to look concerned. Peter Demonides pressed his advantage. You haven't answered my question, Mr. Pappas. Joseph Pappas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I don't know, exactly. Peter Demonides' voice was a whiplash. Then let me tell you, exactly. Mrs. Savalas planned to murder her husband to get him out of the way. She knew that her husband was going to divorce her and cut her out of his will, and that she would be left with nothing. Objection. It came not from Napoleon Chodas, but from the Chief Justice. You're asking the witness to speculate. He looked over at Napoleon Chodas, surprised at the silence of the lawyer. The old man was sitting back on the bench, his eyes half closed. Sorry, Your Honor. But he knew he had made his point. Peter Demonides turned to Chodas. Your witness. Napoleon Chodas rose. Thank you, Mr. Demonides. No questions. The three justices turned to look at one another, puzzled. One of them spoke up. Mr. Chodas, you are aware that this will be your only opportunity to cross-examine this witness. Napoleon Chodas blinked. Yes, Your Honor. In view of his testimony, you don't wish to ask him any questions. Napoleon Chodas waved a hand in the air and said, vaguely, no, Your Honor. The judge sighed. Very well. The prosecutor may call his next witness. The next witness was Mihalis Haritonides, a burly man in his 60s. When Haritonides was sworn in, the prosecutor asked, would you tell the court your occupation, please? Yes, sir. I manage a hotel. Would you tell us the name of the hotel? The Argos. And this hotel is located where? In Corfu. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Haritonides, whether any of the people in this room have ever stayed at your hotel. Haritonides looked around and said, yes, sir. Him and her. Let the recoft show that the witness is pointing to Joseph Pappas and Anastasia Savalas. He turned back to the witness. Did they stay at your hotel more than once? Oh, yes, sir. They were there half a dozen times, at least. And they spent the night there, together, in the same room. Yes, sir. They usually came for the weekend. Thank you, Mr. Haritonides. He looked at Napoleon Chodas, your witness. No questions. The Chief Justice turned to the other two justices, and they whispered among themselves for a moment. The Chief Justice looked toward Napoleon Chodes. You have no questions for this witness, Mr. Chodes? No, Your Honor. I believe his testimony. It's a nice hotel, I've stayed there myself. The Chief Justice stared at Napoleon Chodes for a long moment, then he turned to the prosecutor. The state may call its next witness. The state would like to call Dr. Vasilis Francescos. A tall, distinguished-looking man rose and moved toward the witness box. He was sworn in. Dr. Francescos, would you be good enough to tell the court what kind of medicine you practice? I'm a general practitioner. Is that equivalent to a family doctor? It's another way of putting it, yes. How long have you been in practice, doctor? Almost 30 years. And you were licensed by the state, of course. Of course. Dr. Francescos, was George Savalas a patient of yours? Yes, he was. For what period of time? A little more than 10 years. And were you treating Mr. Savalas for any specific problem? Well, the first time I saw him, he came to me because he had high blood pressure. And you treated him for that? Yes. But you saw him after that? Oh, yes. He would come to see me from time to time when he had bronchitis, or a liver ailment, nothing serious. When was the last time you saw Mr. Savalas? In December of last year. That was shortly before he died. That's right. Did he come to your office, doctor? No. I went to see him at his home. Do you usually make house calls? Not usually, no. But in this case you made an exception. Yes. Why? The doctor hesitated. Well, he wasn't in any shape to come to the office. What shape was he in? He had lacerations, some bruised ribs, and a concussion. Was he in some kind of accident? Dr. Francescos hesitated. No. He told me he had been beaten by his wife. There was an audible gasp from the courtroom. The Chief Justice said, angrily, Mr. Chodes, aren't you going to object to putting hearsay testimony into the record? Napoleon Chodes looked up and said mildly, oh, thank you, Your Honor. Yes, I object. But, of course, the damage had already been done. The jurors were now looking at the defendant with overt hostility. Thank you, Dr. Francescos. No more questions. Peter Demonides turned to Chodes and said smugly, your witness. No questions. There followed a steady flow of witnesses, a maid who testified that she had seen Mrs. Savalas going into the chauffeur's quarters on several occasions. A butler who testified that he had heard George Savalas threaten to divorce his wife and change his will. Neighbors who had heard the noisy arguments between the Savalases. And still Napoleon Chodes had no questions for any of the witnesses. The net was fast closing in on Anastasia Savalas. Peter Demonides could already feel the glow of victory. In his mind's eye he could see the headlines in the newspapers. This trial was going to be the fastest murder trial in history. This trial could even end today, he thought. The great Napoleon Chodes is a beaten man. I would like to call Mr. Nico Mentakis to the stand. Mentakis was a thin, earnest young man, with a slow and careful manner of speech. Mr. Mentakis, would you tell the court your occupation, please? Yes, sir. I work at a nursery. You take care of children? Oh no, sir. It's not that kind of nursery. We have trees and flowers, and all kinds of plants. Oh, I see. So you are an expert on growing things. I should be. I've been at it for a long time. And I presume that a part of your job is to make sure that the plants you have for sale stay healthy. Oh, yes, sir. We take very good care of them. We wouldn't sell any ailing plants to our customers. Most of them are regulars. By that, you mean the same customers keep coming back to you? Yes, sir. His voice was proud. We give good service. Tell me, Mr. Mentakis, was Mrs. Savalas one of your regular customers? Oh, yes, sir. Mrs. Savalas loves plants and flowers. The Chief Justice said impatiently, Mr. Demonides, the court does not feel that this line of questioning is pertinent. Would you move on to something else, or? Single quote. If the court will let me finish, Your Honor, this witness has a very important bearing on the case. The Chief Justice looked toward Napoleon Chodes. Mr. Chodes, do you have any objection to this line of questioning? Napoleon Chodes looked up and blinked. What? No, Your Honor. The Chief Justice stared at him in frustration, and then turned to Peter Demonides. Very well. You may proceed. Mr. Mentakis, did Mrs. Savalas come to you one day in December and tell you that she was having problems with some of her plants? Yes, sir, she did. In fact, didn't she say that there was an infestation of insects that was destroying her plants? Yes, sir. And didn't she ask you for something to get rid of them? Yes, sir. Would you tell the court what it was? I sold her some antimony. And would you tell the court exactly what that is? It's a poison, like arsenic. There was an uproar from the courtroom. The Chief Justice slammed down his gavel. If there's another outburst, I'm going to order the bailiff to clear this court. He turned to Peter Demonides. You may continue the questioning. So you sold her a quantity of antimony? Yes, sir. And would you say it's a deadly poison? You compared it to arsenic. Oh, yes, sir. It's deadly, all right. And you entered the sale in your record book, as you are required to do by law when you sell any poison? Yes, sir. And did you bring those records with you, Mr. Mentakis? I did. He handed Peter Demonides a ledger. The prosecuting attorney walked over to the judges. Your Honors, I would like this to be labeled Exhibit A. He turned to the witness. I have no more questions. He looked over at Napoleon Chodas. Napoleon Chodas looked up and shook his head. No questions. Peter Demonides took a deep breath. It was time for his bombshell. I would like to introduce Exhibit B. He turned toward the back of the room, and said to a bailiff standing near the door, would you bring it in now, please? The bailiff hurried out and a few moments later he returned carrying a bottle of cough syrup on a tray. There was a noticeable amount missing. The spectators watched, fascinated, as the bailiff handed the bottle to the prosecutor. Peter Demonides placed it on a table in front of the jurors. Ladies and gentlemen, you are looking at the murder weapon. This is the weapon that killed George Savalas. This is the cough syrup that Mrs. Savalas administered to her husband on the night he died. It is loaded with antimony. As you can see, the victim swallowed some and 20 minutes later he was dead. Napoleon Chodas rose to his feet, and said mildly, objection. There is no way the prosecuting attorney has of knowing that it was from that particular bottle that the deceased was medicated. And Peter Demonides slammed the trap shut. With all due respect to my learned colleague, Mrs. Savalas has admitted that she gave her husband this syrup during a coughing spell on the night he died. It has been kept under lock and key by the police until it was brought into this court a few minutes ago. The coroner has testified that George Savalas died of antimony poisoning. This cough syrup is loaded with antimony. He looked at Napoleon Chodas challengingly. Napoleon Chodas shook his head in defeat. Then I guess there's no doubt. Peter Demonides said triumphantly, none at all. Thank you, Mr. Chodas. The prosecution rests its case. The Chief Justice turned to Napoleon Chodas. Is the defense ready for its summation? Napoleon Chodas rose. Yes, Your Honor. He stood there for a long moment. Then he slowly ambled forward. He stood in front of the jury box, scratching his head as though trying to figure out what he was going to say. When he finally began, he spoke slowly, searching for words. I suppose some of you must be wondering why I haven't cross-examined any of the witnesses. Well, to tell you the truth, I thought Mr. Demonides here did such a fine job that it wasn't necessary for me to ask them any questions. The fool is pleading my case for me, Peter Demonides thought gleefully. Napoleon Chodas turned to look at the bottle of cough syrup for a moment, then turned back to the jurors. All the witnesses seemed very honest. But they didn't really prove anything, did they? What I mean is. Single quote. He shook his head. Well, when you add everything up that those witnesses said, it comes down to just one thing. A pretty young girl is married to an old man who probably couldn't satisfy her sexually. He nodded toward Joseph Pappas. So she found a young man who could. But we all knew that much from the newspapers, didn't we? There's nothing secret about their affair. The whole world knew about it. It's been written up in every trashy magazine in the world. Now, you and I might not approve of her behavior, ladies and gentlemen, but Anastasia Savalas is not on trial here for adultery. She's not in this court because she has normal sexual urges that any young woman might have. No, she's being tried in this court for murder. He turned to look at the bottle again, as though fascinated by it. Let the old man rave on, Peter Demonides thought. He glanced up at the clock on the courtroom wall. It was 5 minutes to 12. The judges always called a recess at noon. The old fool won't be able to finish his summation. He wasn't even smart enough to wait until court was recessed again. Why was I ever afraid of him? Peter Demonides wondered. Napoleon Chodes was rambling on. Let's examine the evidence together, shall we? Some plants of Mrs. Savalas were ailing and she cared enough about them to want to save them. She went to Mr. Mentakis, a plant expert, who advised her to use antimony. So she followed his advice. Do you call that murder? I certainly don't. And then there's the testimony of the house keeper, who said that Mrs. Savalas sent all the servants away so she could have a honeymoon dinner with her husband that she was going to prepare for him. Well, I think the truth is that the housekeeper was probably half in love with Mr. Savalas herself. You don't work for a man for 25 years unless you have pretty deep feelings for him. She resented Anastasia Savalas. Couldn't you tell that from her tone? Chodes coughed slightly and cleared his throat. So, let us assume that the defendant, deep in her heart, really loved her husband, and she was trying desperately to make the marriage work. How does any woman show love for a man? Well, one of the most basic ways, I guess, is to cook for him. Isn't that a form of love? I think it is. He turned to look at the bottle again. And isn't another to tend to him when he's ill in sickness and in health? The clock on the wall showed 1 minute to 12. Ladies and gentlemen, I told you when this trial began to look into the face of this woman. That's not the face of a murderess. Those aren't the eyes of a killer. Peter Demonides watched the jurors as they stared at the defendant. He had never seen such open hostility. He had the jury in his pocket. The law is very clear, ladies and gentlemen. As you will be informed by our honorable judges, in order to return a verdict of guilty, you must have no doubt at all about the guilt of the defendant. None. As Napoleon Chodes talked, he coughed again, drawing a handkerchief from his pocket to cover his mouth. He walked over to the bottle of syrup on the table in front of the jury. When you come right down to it, the prosecutor hasn't proved anything, really, has he? Except that this is the bottle Mrs. Savalas handed to her husband. The truth is, the state has no case at all. As he finished the sentence, he had a coughing spell unconsciously. He reached for the bottle of cough medicine, unscrewed the cap, raised the bottle to his lips and took a large swallow. Everyone in the courtroom stared, mesmerized, and there was a gasp of horror. The courtroom was in an uproar. The Chief Justice said in alarm, "Mr. Chodes." Single quote. Napoleon Chodes took another swallow. Your Honor, the prosecutor's case is a mockery of justice. George Savalas did not die at the hands of this woman. The defense rests its case. The clock struck 12. A bailiff hurried up to the Chief Justice and whispered. The Chief Justice pounded his gavel. Order. Order. We are going to recess. The jury will retire and try to reach a verdict. Court will reconvene at 2 o'clock. Peter Demonides was standing there, transfixed. Someone had switched bottles. But no, that was impossible. The evidence had been guarded every moment. Could the pathologist have been that wrong? Demonides turned to speak to his assistant, and when he looked around for Napoleon Chodes, he had disappeared. At 2 o'clock, when the court reconvened, the jury slowly filed into the courtroom and took their seats. Napoleon Chodes was missing. The son of a bitch is dead, Peter Demonides thought, and even as he was thinking it, Napoleon Chodes walked through the door, looking perfectly healthy. Everyone in the courtroom turned around to stare at him as he walked to his seat. The Chief Justice said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman of the jury stood up. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant not guilty." There was a spontaneous burst of applause from the spectators. Peter Demonides felt the blood drain from his face. The bastard has done it to me again, he thought. He glanced up and Napoleon Chodes was watching him, grinning. Chapter 8 *. The firm of Tritsis and Tritsis was without question the most prestigious law firm in Greece. The founders had long since retired, and the firm belonged to Napoleon Chodes. There were half a dozen partners, but Chodes was the guiding genius. Whenever people of wealth were accused of murder, their thoughts invariably turned to Napoleon Chodes. His record was phenomenal. In his years of defending people accused of capital crimes, Chodes had scored success after success. The recent trial of Anastasia Savalas had made headlines all over the world. Chodes had defended a client in what everyone thought was a clear-cut case of murder, and he had won a spectacular victory. He had taken a big risk with that one, but he had known that it was the only way he could save his client's life. He smiled to himself as he recalled the faces of the jurors when he had taken a swallow of the syrup loaded with a deadly poison. He had carefully timed his summation so that he would be interrupted at exactly 12 o'clock. That was the key to everything. If the judges had changed their fixed routine and gone past 12 o'clock. He shuddered to think what would have happened. As it was, an unexpected occurrence had arisen that had nearly cost him his life. After the recess, Chodes was hurrying down the corridor when a group of reporters blocked his path. "Mr. Chodes, how did you know the cough syrup wasn't poisoned? Can you explain how? Do you think someone switched bottles? Did Anastasia Savalas have? Please, gentlemen, I'm afraid I have to answer a call of nature. I'll be happy to answer your questions later." He hurried on to the men's room at the end of the corridor. A sign on the knob read, "Out of order." A reporter said, "I guess you'll have to find another men's room." Napoleon Chodes grinned. "I'm afraid I can't wait." He pushed the door open, walked in and locked it behind him. The team was inside, waiting for him. The doctor complained, "I was beginning to get worried. Antimony works fast." He snapped at his assistant. "Get the stomach pump ready." "Yes, doctor." The doctor turned to Napoleon Chodes. "Lie on the floor. I'm afraid this is going to be unpleasant." "When I consider the alternative," Napoleon Chodes grinned, "I'm sure I won't mind." Napoleon Chodes' fee for saving Anastasia Savalas' life was $1 million, deposited in a Swiss bank account. Chodes had a palatial home in Kolonara, a lovely residential section of Athens, a villa on the island of Corfu, and an apartment in Paris on Avenue Foch. All in all, Napoleon Chodes had excellent reason to be pleased with his life. There was only one cloud on his horizon. His name was Frederick Stavros, and he was the newest member of Tritsis and Tritsis. The other lawyers in the firm were constantly complaining about Stavros. "He's second-rate, Napoleon. He doesn't belong in a firm like this. Stavros almost bungled my case. The man's a fool. Did you hear what Stavros did yesterday in court? The judge almost threw him out. Damn it, why don't you fire that Stavros fellow? He's a fifth wheel here. We don't need him, and he's hurting our reputation." Napoleon Chodes was only too well aware of that. And he was almost tempted to blurt out the truth. "Can't fire him." But all he said was, "Give him a chance. Stavros will work out fine." And that was all his partners could get out of him. A philosopher once said, "Be careful what you wish for, you might get it." Frederick Stavros, the junior member of Tritsis and Tritsis, had gotten his wish, and it had made him one of the most miserable men on earth. He was unable to sleep or eat, and his weight had dropped alarmingly. "You must see a doctor, Frederick," his wife insisted, "you look terrible." "No, it wouldn't do any good." He knew that what was wrong with him was something no doctor could cure. His conscience was killing him. Frederick Stavros was an intense young man, eager, ambitious, and idealistic. For years he had worked out of a shabby office in the poor Monastiraki section of Athens, fighting for indigent clients, often working without fees. When he had met Napoleon Chodes, his life changed overnight. A year earlier, Stavros had defended Larry Douglas, on trial with Noel Page for the murder of Douglas's wife. Catherine. Napoleon Chodes had been hired by the powerful Constantine Demiris to defend his mistress. From the beginning, Stavros had been happy to let Chodes take charge of both defenses. He was in awe of the brilliant lawyer. "You should see Chodes in action," he would say to his wife, "the man is incredible. I wish I could join his firm someday." As the trial was nearing its end, it took an unexpected turn. A smiling Napoleon Chodes assembled Noel Page, Larry Douglas and Frederick Stavros in a private chamber. Chodes said to Stavros, "I have just had a conference with the judges. If the defendants are willing to change their pleas to guilty, the judges have agreed to give each of them a 5-year sentence, 4 years of which will be suspended. In reality they will never have to serve more than 6 months." He turned to Larry. "Because you are an American, Mr. Douglas, you will be deported. You will never be permitted to return to Greece." Noel Page and Larry Douglas had eagerly agreed to change their pleas. 15 minutes later, as the defendants and their lawyers stood in front of the bench, the Chief Justice said, "The Greek courts have never given the death penalty in a case where a murder has not been definitely proven to have been committed. My colleagues and I were, for that reason, frankly surprised when the defendants changed their pleas to guilty in mid-trial. I pronounce that the sentence on the 2 defendants, Noel Page and Lawrence Douglas, shall be execution by a firing squad. To be carried out within 90 days from this date. And that was the moment when Stavros knew that Napoleon Chodas had tricked them all. There had never been a deal. Chodas had been hired by Konstantin Demiris not to defend Noelle Page, but to make sure she was convicted. This was Demiris' revenge on the woman who had betrayed him. Stavros had been an unwitting party to a cold-blooded frame-up. Can't let this happen, Stavros thought. Go tell the Chief Justice what Chodas did and the verdict will be overturned. And then Napoleon Chodas had come up to Stavros and said, "If you're free tomorrow, why don't you come and have lunch with me, Frederick? I'd like you to meet my partners." 4 weeks later, Frederick Stavros was a full partner in the prestigious firm of Tritsis and Tritsis, with a large office and a generous salary. He had sold his soul to the devil. But he had come to the realization that it was a bargain too terrible to keep. Can't go on like this. He could not shake off his deep feelings of guilt. "I'm a murderer," he thought. Frederick Stavros agonized over his dilemma, and finally came to a decision. He walked into Napoleon Chodas' office early one morning. "Leon. My God, man, you look terrible," Napoleon Chodas said. "Why don't you take a little vacation, Frederick? It will do you good." But Stavros knew that this was not the answer to his problem. "Leon, I'm very grateful for what you've done for me, but I can't stay here." Chodas looked at him in surprise. "What are you talking about? You're doing fine." "No, I'm being torn apart." "Torn apart? I don't understand what's bothering you." Frederick Stavros stared at him incredulously. What you and I did to Noelle Page and Larry Douglas. Don't you feel any guilt?" Chodas' eyes narrowed. "Careful, Frederick. Sometimes justice must be served by devious means." Napoleon Chodas smiled. "Believe me, we have nothing to reproach ourselves with. They were guilty. We convicted them. We tricked them. I can't live with it any longer. I'm sorry. I'm giving you my notice. I'll stay here until the end of the month. I won't accept your resignation," Chodas said firmly. "Why don't you do as I suggest? Take a vacation and…" "No. I could never be happy here, knowing what I know. I'm sorry." Napoleon Chodas studied him, his eyes hard. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're throwing away a brilliant career. Your life." "No, I'm saving my life." "So you've definitely made up your mind." "Yes. I'm really sorry, Leon. But you don't have to worry, I won't ever discuss what happened." He turned and walked out of the office. Napoleon Chodas sat at his desk for a long time, lost in thought. Finally, he made a decision. He picked up the telephone and dialed a number. "Would you tell Mr. Demiris I must meet with him this afternoon? Tell him it's urgent." At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Napoleon Chodas was seated in Konstantin Demiris' office. "What's the problem, Leon?" Demiris asked. "There may not be a problem," Chodas replied carefully, "but I thought I should inform you that Frederick Stavros came in to see me this morning. He's decided to quit the firm." "Stavros? Larry Douglas's lawyer. So, it seems that his conscience is bothering him." There was a heavy silence. "I see. He promised not to discuss what occurred that day in court. Do you believe him?" "Yes. As a matter of fact, I do, Costa." Konstantin Demiris smiled. "Well, then, we have nothing to worry about, have we?" Napoleon Chodas rose, relieved. "I suppose not. I just thought you should know. You were right to tell me. Are you free for dinner next week?" "Of course. Till give you a call, and we'll arrange something." "Thank you, Costa." On Friday, in the late afternoon, the ancient Kapnikaria church in downtown Athens was filled with the sound of silence, peaceful and hushed. In a corner next to the altar, Frederick Stavros knelt before Father Constantino. The priest placed a cloth over Stavros' head. "I have sinned, Father. I am beyond redemption. Man's great trouble, my son, is that he thinks he is only human." "What are your sins?" "I am a murderer. You have taken lives." "Yes, Father. I don't know what to do to atone." "God knows what to do. We will ask him. I let myself be led astray, out of vanity and greed. It happened a year ago. I was defending a man accused of murder. The trial was going well. But then Napoleon Chodas." When Frederick Stavros left the church half an hour later, he felt like a different man. It was as though a tremendous burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He felt cleansed by the centuries-old ritual of confession. He had told the priest everything, and for the first time since that terrible day, he felt whole again. Start a new life. "I'll move to another city and begin fresh. I'll try to make up somehow for the terrible thing I've done. Thank you, Father, for giving me another chance. Darkness had fallen and the center of Hermosa Square was almost deserted. As Frederick Stavros reached the street corner, the light turned green, and he started to cross. When he reached the middle of the intersection, a black limousine started down the hill, its headlights out, hurtling toward him like a giant, mindless monster. Stavros stared, frozen. It was too late to jump out of the way. There was a thundering roar and Stavros felt his body being smashed and split open. There was an instant of excruciating pain, and then darkness. Napoleon Chodes was an early riser. He enjoyed his moments of solitude before the pressures of the day began to engulf him. He always breakfasted alone, and read the morning newspapers with his meal. On this particular morning there were several items of interest. Premier Themistocles Sophoulis had formed a new 5-party coalition cabinet. Must send him a note of congratulation. Chinese communist forces were reported to have reached the north bank of the Yangtze River. Harry Truman and Alban Barkley were inaugurated as President and Vice President of the United States. Napoleon Chodes turned to page 2, and his blood froze. The item that caught his eye read, Mr. Frederick Stavros, a partner in the prestigious law firm of Tritsis and Tritsis, was struck and killed last evening by a hit-and-run driver as he was leaving Capnery at church. Witnesses report that the vehicle was a black limousine with no license plates. Mr. Stavros was a major figure in the sensational murder trial of Noel Page and Larry Douglas. He was the attorney for Larry Douglas and Napoleon Chodes stopped reading. He sat in his chair, rigid, his breakfast forgotten. An accident. Was it an accident? Konstantin Demiris had told him there was nothing to worry about. But too many people had made the mistake of taking Demiris at face value. Chodes reached for the telephone and called Konstantin Demiris. A secretary put him through. Have you read the morning papers yet? Chodes asked. No, I haven't. Why? Frederick Stavros is dead. What? It was an exclamation of surprise. What are you talking about? He was killed last night by a hit-and-run driver. My God. I'm sorry, Leon. Have they caught the driver? No, not yet. Maybe I can put a little extra pressure on the police. Nobody's safe these days. By the way, how is Thursday for you for dinner? Fine. It's a date. Napoleon Chodes was an expert at reading between the lines. Konstantin Demiris was genuinely surprised. He had nothing to do with Stavros' death, Chodes decided. The following morning, Napoleon Chodes drove into the private garage of his office building and parked his car. As he moved toward the elevator, a young man appeared out of the shadows. Do you have a match? An alarm in Chodes' mind went off. The man was a stranger, and he had no business being in this garage, certainly. Without thinking, Chodes slammed his briefcase into the man's face. The stranger screamed out in pain. You son of a bitch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gun with a silencer attached. Hey. What's going on here? A voice called. A uniformed guard was running toward them. The stranger hesitated for an instant, then ran for the open door. The guard reached Chodes' side. Are you all right, Mr. Chodes? Ah, yes. Napoleon Chodes found himself struggling for breath. I'm fine. What was he trying to do? Napoleon Chodes said slowly, I'm not sure. It could have been a coincidence, Chodes told himself, as he sat at his desk. It's possible that the man was simply trying to rob me. But you don't use a gun with a silencer to rob people. No, he intended to kill me. And Konstantin Demiris would have professed to have been as shocked by the news as he had pretended to have been about the death of Frederick Stavros. Should have known, Chodes thought. Demiris is not a man to take risks. He can't afford to leave any loose ends. Well, Mr. Demiris is in for a surprise. Napoleon Chodes' secretary's voice came over the intercom. Mr. Chodes, you're due in court in 30 minutes. Today was his summation in a serial murder case, but Chodes, was too shaken to appear in a courtroom. Call the judge and featuring explain that I'm ill. Have one of the partners cover for me. No more calls. He took a tape recorder from a desk drawer and sat there, thinking. Then he began to speak. Early that afternoon, Napoleon Chodes appeared at the office of the state prosecuting attorney, Peter Demonides, carrying a manila envelope. The receptionist recognized him at once. Good afternoon, Mr. Chodes. May I help you? I want to see Mr. Demonides. Oh, he's in a meeting. Do you have an appointment? No. Would you please tell him I'm here, and that it's urgent? Yes, of course. 15 minutes later, Napoleon Chodes was ushered into the office of the prosecuting attorney. "Well," Demonides said. "Muhammad comes to the mountain. What can I do for you? Are we going to do a little plea bargaining this afternoon?" "No. This is a personal matter, Peter. Sit down, Leon." When the two men were seated, Chodes said, "I want to leave an envelope with you. It's sealed, and it is to be opened only in the event of my accidental death." Peter Demonides was studying him, curious. "Are you expecting something to happen to you?" "It's a possibility." "I see. One of your ungrateful clients. It doesn't matter who. You're the only one I can trust. Can you put this away in a safe where no one can get to it?" "Of course." He leaned forward. "You look frightened." "I am. Would you like my office to give you some protection? I could send a policeman along with you." Chodes tapped the envelope. "This is the only protection I need." "All right. If you're sure." "I'm sure." Chodes rose and held out his hand. "Epharisto, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this." Peter Demonides smiled. "Paracalo. You owe me one." 1 hour later, a uniformed messenger appeared at the offices of the Hellenic Trade Corporation. He approached one of the secretaries. "I have a package for Mr. Demyrus. Till sign for it. I have orders to deliver it to Mr. Demyrus personally." "I'm sorry, I can't interrupt him. Who is the package from?" "Napoleon Chodes." "You're sure you can't just leave it?" "Yes, ma'am. Till see if Mr. Demyrus will accept it." She pushed down an intercom switch. "Excuse me, Mr. Demyrus. A messenger has a package for you from Mr. Chodes." Demyrus' voice came over the intercom. "Bring it in, Irene. He says he has orders to deliver it to you personally." There was a pause. "Come in with him." Irene and the messenger entered the office. "Are you Constantine Demyrus?" "Yes." "Will you sign for this, please?" Demyrus signed a slip of paper. The messenger laid the envelope on Demyrus' desk. "Thank you." Constantine Demyrus watched his secretary and the messenger leave. He studied the envelope for a moment, his face thoughtful, then opened it. There was a tape player inside. With a tape in it, curious, he pressed a button and the tape began to play. Napoleon Chodes' voice came into the office. "My dear Costa, everything would have been so much simpler if you had believed that Frederick Stavros did not intend to reveal our little secret. I regret even more that you did not believe that I had no intention of discussing that unfortunate affair. I have every reason to think that you were behind the death of poor Stavros, and that it is now your intention to have me killed. Since my life is as precious to me as yours is to you, I must respectfully decline to be your next victim. I have taken the precaution of writing out the details of the part that you and I played in the trial of Noel Page and Larry Douglas, and have placed it in a sealed envelope and given it to the prosecuting attorney to be opened only in the event of my accidental death. So now it is very much in your interest, my friend, to see that I stay alive and well." The tape ended. Constantine Demyrus sat there, staring into space. When Napoleon Chodes returned to his office that afternoon, the fear had left him. Constantine Demyrus was a dangerous man, but he was far from a fool. He was not going to harm anyone at the risk of putting himself in jeopardy. "He's made his move," Chodes thought, "and I have checkmated him." He smiled to himself. "Suppose I had better make other plans for dinner Thursday." During the next few days, Napoleon Chodes was busy getting ready for a new murder trial involving a wife who had killed her husband's 2 mistresses. Chodes rose early each morning and worked until late at night, preparing his cross-examinations. His instincts told him that against all odds he had another winner on Wednesday night. He worked at the office until midnight, and then drove home. He reached his villa at 1:00 and his butler greeted him at the door. "Would you care for anything, Mr. Chodes? I can prepare some mezdas if you're hungry, or…" "No, thank you. I'm fine. Go on to bed." Napoleon Chodes went up to his bedroom. He spent the next hour going over the trial in his mind, and finally at 2 o'clock he fell asleep. He had dreams he was in court, cross-examining a witness, when the witness suddenly started to tear off his clothes. "Why are you doing that?" Chodes demanded. Burning up." Chodes looked around the crowded courtroom and saw that all the spectators were undressing. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I must object to…" The judge was taking off his robe. "It's too hot in here," he said. "It is hot in here." And noisy Napoleon Chodes opened his eyes. Flames were licking at the bedroom door and smoke was pouring into the room. Napoleon sat up, instantly wide awake. The house is on fire. Why didn't the alarm go off? The door was beginning to buckle from the intense heat. Chodas hurried to the window, choking on the smoke. He tried to force the window open but it was jammed shut. The smoke was getting thicker, and it was becoming more difficult to breathe. There was no escape. Burning EMT greater than hers started dropping from the ceiling. A wall collapsed and a sheet of flames engulfed him. He screamed. His hair and pajamas were on fire. Blindly, he threw himself at the closed window and crashed through it, his blazing body hurtling to the ground 16 feet below. Early the following morning, State Prosecutor Peter Demonides was ushered into Konstantin Demiris' study by a maid. Kalernera, Peter, Demiris said. "Thank you for coming. Have you brought it?" "Yes, sir." He handed Demiris the sealed envelope that Napoleon Chodas had given him. "I thought you might like to keep this here." "That's thoughtful of you, Peter. Would you care for some breakfast?" "Evharisto." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Demiris." "Costa. Call me Costa. I've had my eye on you for some time, Peter. I think you have an important future. I'd like to find a suitable position for you in my organization. Would you be interested?" Peter Demonides smiled. "Yes, Costa. I would be very interested." "Good. We'll have a nice chat about it over breakfast." Chapter 9. London. Catherine spoke to Konstantin Demiris at least once a week and it became a pattern. He kept sending gifts and when she protested he assured her that they were merely small tokens of his appreciation. "Evelyn told me how well you handled the Baxter situation." Or, "I heard from Evelyn that your idea is saving us a lot of money in shipping charges." As a matter of fact, Catherine was proud of how well she was doing. She had found half a dozen things in the office that could be improved. Her old skills had come back, and she knew that the efficiency of the office had increased a great deal because of her. "I'm very proud of you," Konstantin Demiris told her, and Catherine felt a glow. He was such a wonderful, caring man. "It's almost time to make my move," Demiris decided. With Stavros and Chodas safely out of the way, the only person who could link him with what had happened was Catherine. The danger of that was slight but, as Napoleon Chodas had found out, Demiris was not a man to take chances. "It's a pity," Demiris thought, "that she has to go. She's so beautiful. But first, the villa in Rufina." He had bought the villa. He would take Catherine there and make love to her just as Larry Douglas had made love to Noelle after that. From time to time, Catherine was reminded of the past. She read in the London Times the news of the deaths of Frederick Stavros and Napoleon Chodas, and the names would have meant nothing to her except for the mention that they had been the attorneys for Larry Douglas and Noelle Page. That night she had the dream again. One morning, Catherine saw a newspaper item that jolted her. William Fraser, assistant to U.S. President Harry Truman, has arrived in London to work out a new trade agreement with the British Prime Minister. She put down the paper, feeling foolishly vulnerable. William Fraser. He had been such an important part of her life. What would have happened if I hadn't left him? Catherine sat at her desk, smiling tremulously, staring at the item in the newspaper. William Fraser was one of the dearest men she had ever known. Just the memory of him made her feel warm and loved. And he was here in London. "I have to see him," she thought. According to the newspaper, he was staying at Claridge's. Catherine dialed the number of the hotel, and her fingers were trembling. She had a feeling that the past was about to become the present. She found herself thrilled at the thought of seeing Fraser. "What will he say when he hears my voice? When he sees me again?" the operator was saying. "Good morning, Claridge's." Catherine took a deep breath. "Mr. William Fraser, please." "I'm sorry, madam. Did you say Mr. or Mrs. William Fraser?" Catherine felt as though she had been struck. "What a fool I am. Why didn't I think of that? Of course he could be married by now. Madam. Single quote. Never mind. Thank you." She slowly replaced the receiver. "I'm too late. It's over." Costa was right. Let the past remain the past. Loneliness can be a corrosive, eating away at the spirit. Everyone needs to share joy and glory and pain. Catherine was living in a world full of strangers, watching the happiness of other couples, hearing the echo of the laughter of lovers. But she refused to feel sorry for herself. "I'm not the only woman in the world who's alone. I'm alive. I'm alive." There was never a shortage of things to do in London. The London cinemas were filled with American films and Catherine enjoyed going to them. She saw The Razor's Edge and Anna and the King of Siam. Gentleman's Agreement was a disturbing film, and Gary Grant was wonderful in The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer. Catherine went to concerts at the Albert Hall and attended the ballet at Sadler's Wells. She went to Stratford-upon-Avon to see Anthony Quayle in The Taming of the Shrew, and to see Sir Laurence Olivier in Richard All. But it was not as much fun going alone, and then Kirk Reynolds came along. It was in the office that a tall, attractive man walked up to Catherine and said, "I'm Kirk Reynolds. Where have you been? I beg your pardon. I've been waiting for you." That was how it began. Kirk Reynolds was an American attorney, working for Constantine Demiris on international mergers. He was in his 40s, serious-minded, intelligent and attentive. When she discussed Kirk Reynolds with Evelyn, Catherine said, "Do you know what I like about him most? He makes me feel like a woman. I haven't felt that way in a long time." "I don't know," Evelyn demurred. "I'd be careful if I were you. Don't rush into anything." "I won't," Catherine promised. Plus Kirk Reynolds took Catherine on a legal journey through London. They went to the Old Bailey, where criminals had been tried over the centuries, and they wandered through the main hall of the law courts, past grave-looking barristers in wigs and gowns. They visited the site of Newgate Prison, built in the 18th century. Just in front of where the prison had been, the road widened, then unexpectedly narrowed again. "That's odd," Catherine said. "I wonder why they built the road like that." "To accommodate the crowds. This is where they used to hold public executions." Catherine shuddered. It hit too close to home. One evening, Kirk Reynolds took Catherine to East India Dock Road, along the piers. "Not too long ago, this was a place where policemen walked in pairs," Reynolds said. "It was the hangout for criminals. The area was dark and forbidding, and it still looked dangerous to Catherine." They had dinner at the Prospect of Whitby, one of England's oldest pubs, seated on a balcony built over the Thames, watching the barges move down the river past the big ships that were on their way to sea. Catherine loved the unusual names of London pubs. Ye Old Cheshire Cheese and the Falstaff and the Goat and Boots. On another night they went to a colorful old public house in City Road, called the Eagle. "Till bet you used to sing about this place when you were a child," Kirk said. Catherine stared at him. "Sing about it? I've never even heard of this place." "Yes, you have. The Eagle is where an old nursery rhyme comes from." "What nursery rhyme?" "Years ago, City Road used to be the heart of the tailoring trade, and toward the end of the week, the tailors would find themselves short of money, and they'd put their pressing iron a weasel into pawn until payday. So someone wrote a nursery rhyme about it. Up and down the City Road, in and out the Eagle, that's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel." Catherine laughed. "How in the world did you know that? Lawyers are supposed to know everything. But there's one thing I don't know. Do you ski?" "I'm afraid not." "Why?" ? He was suddenly serious. "I'm going to St. Moritz. They have wonderful ski instructors there. Will you come with me, Catherine?" The question caught her completely off guard. Kirk was waiting for an answer. I don't know, Kirk. Will you think about it?" "Yes." Her body was trembling. She was remembering how exciting it had been to make love with Larry, and she wondered whether she could ever feel anything like that again. "Till think about it." Catherine decided to introduce Kirk to Vim. They picked Vim up at his flat and took him to the Ivy for dinner. During the entire evening, Vim never once looked directly at Kirk Reynolds. He seemed completely withdrawn. Kirk looked askance at Catherine. She mouthed, "Talk to him." Kirk nodded and turned to Vim. "Do you like London, Vim?" "It's all right. Do you have a favorite city?" "No. Do you enjoy your job?" "It's all right." Kirk looked at Catherine, shook his head and shrugged. Catherine mouthed, "Please." Kirk sighed, and turned back to Vim. "I'm playing golf Sunday, Vim. Do you play?" Vim said, "In golf the iron-headed clubs are a driving iron, mid-iron, mid-mashy, mashy, iron, mashy, spade, mashy, mashy, niblick, niblick, shorter, niblick and putter. Wooden-headed clubs are the driver, brassy, spoon and baffy." Kirk Reynolds blinked. "You must be pretty good." "He's never played," Catherine explained. "Vim just knows things. He can do anything with mathematics." Kirk Reynolds had had enough. He had hoped to spend an evening alone with Catherine, and she had brought along this nuisance. Kirk forced a smile. "Really?" He turned to Vim and asked innocently, "Do you happen to know the 59th power of 2? Vim sat there in silence for 30 seconds studying the tablecloth, and, as Kirk was about to speak, Vim said, 576,460,752,303,423,488. Jesus. Kirk said. Is that for real? Yeah, Vim snarled. That's for real. Catherine turned to Vim. Vim, can you extract the sixth root of? Single quote. She'd picked a number at random. 24,137,585. They both watched Vim as he sat there, his face expressionless. 25 seconds later he said, 17, the remainder is 16. I can't believe this, Kirk exclaimed. Believe it, Catherine told him. Kirk looked at Vim. How did you do that? Vim shrugged. Catherine said, Vim can multiply two 4-digit numbers in 30 seconds, and memorize 50 phone numbers in 5 minutes. Once he's learned them, he never forgets them. Kirk Reynolds was looking at Wim Vandeen in astonishment. My office could certainly use someone like you, he said. I've got a job, Wim snapped. When Kirk Reynolds dropped Catherine off at the end of the one evening, he said, You won't forget about St. Moritz, will you? No, I won't forget. Why can't I just say, yes? Konstantin Demiris phoned late that night. Catherine was tempted to tell him about Kirk Reynolds, but at the last moment she decided not to. Chapter 10. Athens. Father Constantino was perturbed. From the moment he had seen the newspaper report of Frederick Stavros' hit-and-run death, he had been haunted by it. The priest had heard thousands of confessions since he had been ordained, but the dramatic confession of Frederick Stavros, followed by his death, had left an indelible impression. Hey, what's bothering you? Father Constantino turned to look at the beautiful young man lying naked in bed beside him. Nothing, love. Don't I make you happy? You know you do, Georgios. Then what's the problem? You're acting like I'm not here, for Christ's sake. Don't use profanity. I don't like being ignored. I'm sorry, darling. It's just that one of my parishioners was killed in an automobile accident. We all have to go sometime, right? Yes, of course. But this was a very troubled man. You mean he was sick in the head? No. He had a terrible secret, and it was too large a burden for him to carry. What kind of secret? The priest stroked the young man's thigh. You know I can't discuss that. It was told to me in the confessional. I thought we didn't have no secrets from each other. We don't, Georgios, but. Single quote. Gamoto. We either do, or we don't. Anyway, you said the guy's dead. What difference can it make now? None, I suppose, but. Single quote. Georgios Lotto wrapped his arms around his bed partner, and whispered in his ear, I'm curious. You're tickling my ear. Lotto began stroking Father Constantino's body. Oh. Don't stop, then tell me. Very well. I suppose it can't really do any harm now. Single quote. 1. Georgios Lotto had come up in the world. He was born in the slums of Athens, and when he was 12 years old he became a male prostitute. In the beginning Lotto had walked the streets, picking up a few dollars for servicing drunks in alleys and tourists in their hotel rooms. He was gifted with dark good looks and a strong, firm body. When he was 16, a pimp said to him, You're a puliki, Georgios. You're giving it away. I can set you up to make a lot of money. And he kept his promise. From that moment on Georgios Lotto serviced only important, wealthy men, and he was handsomely rewarded for it. When Lotto met Nikos Veritos, the personal assistant to the great tycoon, Spyros Lambro, Lotto's life changed. I'm in love with you, Nikos Veritos told the young boy. I want you to stop whoring around. You belong to me now. Sure, Nicky. I love you, too. Veritos was constantly pampering the boy with gifts. He bought his clothes, paid for a small apartment for him and gave him spending money. But he fretted about what Lotto was doing when he was away from him. Veritos solved the problem one day by announcing, I've gotten you a job with Spyros Lambro's company, where I work. So you can keep a fucking eye on me. I won't. Single quote. Of course that's not it, sweetheart. I just like to have you near me. Georgios Lotto had protested at first, but he finally gave in. He found that he actually enjoyed working for the company. He worked in the mail room, and as a delivery boy, and that gave him the freedom to pick up extra money outside, from appreciative clients like Father Constantino. When Georgios Lotto left Father Constantino's bed that afternoon, his mind was in a turmoil. The secret that the priest had confided to him was a stunning piece of news, and Georgios Lotto's mind immediately turned to how he could make money out of it. He could have confided it to Nikos Veritos, but he had bigger plans. I'm going right to the big boss with this, Lotto told himself. That's where the real payoff will be. The following morning, Lotto walked into Spiros Lambros' reception office. The secretary behind the desk looked up. Oh, the mail's early today, Georgios. Georgios. Lotto shook his head. No, ma'am, I have to see Mr. Lambro. She smiled. Really? What do you want to see him about? Do you have a business proposition for him? She teased. Lotto said seriously, no, it's nothing like that. I just got word that my mother is dying, and I have to go back home. I just wanted to thank Mr. Lambro for giving me a job here. It would only take a minute, but if he's too busy. Single quote. He started to turn away. Wait. I'm sure he won't mind. 10 minutes later, Georgios. Lotto was standing in Spiros Lambros' office. He had never been inside before, and the opulence overwhelmed him. Well, young man, I'm sorry to hear your mother is dying. Perhaps a small bonus would. Single quote. Thank you, sir. But that's not really why I'm here. Lambro frowned at him. I don't understand. Mr. Lambro, I have some important information that I think might be valuable to you. He could see the skepticism on Lambro's face. Oh really? I'm afraid I'm rather busy, so if you'll. Single quote. It's about Constantine Demiris. The words tumbled out. I have a good friend who's a priest. He heard a confession from a man who was killed right afterward in a car accident, and what the man told him is about Constantine Demiris. Mr. Demiris did an awful thing. Really awful. He could go to prison for it. But if you're not interested. Spiros Lambro suddenly found himself very interested. Sit down. What's your name? Lotto, sir. Georgios. Lotto. All right, Lotto. Suppose you start at the beginning. The marriage of Constantine Demiris and Melina had been disintegrating for years, but there had never been any physical violence until recently. It had started in the middle of a heated argument over an affair Constantine Demiris was having with Melina's closest friend. You turn every woman into a whore, she screamed. Everything you touch turns to dirt. Skase. Shut your fucking mouth. You can't make me, Melina said defiantly. I'm going to tell the whole world what a pousty you are. My brother was right, you're a monster. Demiris raised his arm and slapped Melina hard across the face. She ran from the room. The following week they had another argument, and Constantine struck her again. Melina packed her bags and took a plane to Attikos, the private island owned by her brother. She stayed there for a week, miserable and lonely. She missed her husband, and she began to make excuses for what he had done. Was my fault, Melina thought. I shouldn't have antagonized Costa. And he didn't mean to hit me. He just lost his temper and didn't know what he was doing. And if Costa didn't care so much about me, he wouldn't have hit me, would he? But in the end, Melina knew they were simply excuses because she could not bear to dissolve her marriage. The following Sunday she returned home. Demiris was in the library. He looked up as Melina entered. So you decided to come back. This is my home, Costa. You're my husband, and I love you, but I want to tell you something. If you ever touch me again, I will kill you. And he looked into her eyes and knew that she meant it. In an odd way, their marriage seemed to improve after that episode. For a long time after that, Constantine was careful never to lose his temper with Melina. He continued to have his affairs, and Melina was too proud to plead with him to stop. One day he'll get tired of all his whores, Melina thought, and he'll realize that he needs only me. On a Saturday evening, Constantine Demiris was putting on a dinner jacket, preparing to go out. Melina came into the room. Where are you going? I have an engagement. Have you forgotten? We're having dinner at Spiros tonight. I haven't forgotten. Something more important has come up. Melina stood there watching him, furious. And I know what it is. You're pulacal and you're going to one of your whores to satisfy it. You should watch your tongue. You're becoming a fishwife, Melina. Demiris examined himself in the mirror. I won't let you do this. What he was doing to her was bad enough, but to insult her brother deliberately on top of everything that had gone before was too much. She had to find a way to hurt him, and there was only one way she knew. We both really should stay home tonight, Melina said. Oh, really? He asked indifferently. And why is that? Don't you know what today is? She taunted him. No. It's the anniversary of the day I killed your son, Costa. I had an abortion. He stood stock still, and she could see the pupils of his eyes darken. "I told the doctors to fix it so I could never have another one of your children," she lied. He completely lost control. "Skasay." And he punched her in the face, and kept hitting. Melina screamed and turned and ran down the hall. Constantine right behind her. He caught her at the head of the stairs. "Till kill you for that," he roared. As he hit her again, Melina lost her balance and fell, crashing down the long staircase. She lay at the bottom, whimpering in pain. "Oh, God. Help me. I've broken something." Demirous stood there, staring down at her, his eyes cold. "Till have one of the maids call a doctor. I don't want to be late for my engagement." 1. The telephone call came shortly before dinner time. "Mr. Lambro. This is Dr. Metaxas. Your sister asked me to call you. She's here in my private hospital. I'm afraid she's been in an accident." Single quote. When Spiros Lambro walked into Melina's hospital room, he walked over to her bed, and stared down at her, appalled. Melina had a broken arm, a concussion, and her face was badly swollen. Spiros Lambro said one word: "Constantine." His voice was trembling with rage. Melina's eyes filled with tears. "He didn't mean it," she whispered. "TM going to destroy him. I swear it on my life." Spiros Lambro had never felt such rage. He could not bear the thought of what Constantine Demirous was doing to Melina. There had to be a way to stop him, but how? He was at a loss. He needed advice. As he had so often in the past, Spiros Lambro decided to consult Madame Pins. Perhaps there was some way in which she would be able to help him. On the way to see her, Lambro thought wryly, "My friends would laugh at me if they thought I was consulting a psychic." But the fact was that in the past, Madame Pires had told him some extraordinary things that had come to pass. "She's got to help me now." They were seated at a table in a dark corner of the dimly lit café. She seemed older than when he had last seen her. She sat there, her eyes fastened on him. "I need some help, Madame Pires," Lambro said. She nodded. "Where to start?" "There was a murder trial about a year and a half ago. A woman named Catherine Douglas was." Single quote. The expression on Madame Pires' face changed. "No," she moaned. Spiros Lambro stared at her, puzzled. "She was murdered by." Single quote. Madame Pires rose. "No. The spirits told me she would die." Spiros Lambro was confused. "She did die," he said. "She was killed by." Single quote. "She's alive." He was completely bewildered. "She can't be. She was here. She came to see me 3 months ago. They kept her at the convent." He stared at her, stock still. And suddenly all the pieces fell into place. They kept her at the convent. One of Demirous' favorite charitable acts was to give money to the convent at Ioannina, the town where Catherine Douglas was supposed to have been murdered. The information Spiros had received from Georgios Lotto fitted in perfectly. Demirous had sent 2 innocent people to their deaths for Catherine's murder while she had been very much alive, hidden away by the nuns, and Lambro knew how he was going to destroy Constantine Demirous. Tony Rizzoli. Chapter 11. Tony Rizzoli's problems were multiplying. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. What had happened was certainly not his fault, but he knew that the family would hold him responsible. They were not tolerant of excuses. What made it particularly frustrating was that the first part of the drug operation had gone perfectly. He had smuggled the shipment into Athens with no problems and had it temporarily stored at a warehouse. He had bribed an airline steward to smuggle it out on a flight from Athens to New York. And then, just 24 hours before the flight, the idiot had been arrested for drunk driving, and the airline had fired him. Tony Rizzoli had turned to an alternate plan. He had arranged for a mule in this case, a 70-year-old tourist named Sarah Murchison who was visiting her daughter in Athens, to take a suitcase back to New York for him. She had no idea what she would be carrying. "It's some souvenirs I promised to send my mother," Tony Rizzoli explained, "and because you're nice enough to do this, I want to pay for your ticket." "Oh, that's not necessary," Sarah Murchison protested. "I'm happy to do it for you. I live not far from your mother's apartment. I look forward to meeting her. And I'm sure she'd like to meet you, too," Tony Rizzoli said glibly. "The problem is, she's pretty sick. But there will be someone there to take the suitcase. She was perfect for the job, a sweet, all-American grandmother. The only thing customs would be worrying about her smuggling would be knitting needles." Sarah Murchison was to leave for New York the following morning. "I'll pick you up and drive you to the airport." "Why, thank you. What a thoughtful young man you are." Your mother must be very proud of you. Yes. We're very close. His mother had been dead for 10 years. The following morning, as Rizzoli was about to leave his hotel for the warehouse to pick up the package, his telephone rang. Mr. Rizzoli. It was a stranger's voice. Yes. This is Dr. Patsaka at the Athens Hospital Emergency Ward. We have a Mrs. Sarah Murchison here. She tripped and fell last night and broke her hip. She was very anxious for me to tell you how sorry. Single quote. Tony Rizzoli slammed the phone down. That was 2 in a row. Where was he going to find another mule? Rizzoli knew he had to be careful. There was a rumor that a hotshot American narcotics agent was in Athens working with the Greek authorities. They were watching all exits from Athens, and planes and ships were routinely being searched. As if that weren't enough, there was another problem. One of his ghosters, a thief who was an addict, had informed him that the police were beginning to search warehouses, looking for stored drugs and other contraband. The pressure was mounting. It was time to explain the situation to the family. Tony Rizzoli left his hotel and walked down Petition Street toward the city telephone exchange. He was not sure whether his hotel phone was being bugged, but he did not want to risk the chance. Number 85 Petition was a large brown stone building with a row of pillars in front, and a plaque that read, OTE. Rizzoli walked into the entry and looked around. 24 telephone booths lined the walls, each one numbered. Shelves were filled with telephone directories from all over the world. In the center of the room was a desk where 4 clerks were taking orders for calls to be placed. People were lined up waiting to be put through. Tony Rizzoli approached one of the women behind the desk. Good morning, he said. Can I help you? I'd like to place an overseas call. There will be a 30-minute wait, I'm afraid. No problem. Would you give me the country and the number, please? Tony Rizzoli hesitated. Sure. He handed a piece of paper to the woman. TD like to make the call collect. Your name?